Hey everyone, tonight we're diving headfirst, and probably face first, into the ancient world. Imagine this, you're suddenly standing on a dusty, chariot-rutted street, the air thick with smells you can't quite place but definitely don't love, and the guy next to you is wearing what looks suspiciously like a bedsheet. Yeah, you're in ancient Rome, or maybe some equally unforgiving corner of history, and let's be brutally honest, you probably won't survive. Your phone's just a useless brick. Your artisanal sourdough starter is centuries away from being a hipster trend, and your sensible walking shoes? Not invented yet. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And hey, drop a comment letting us know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always cool to see how far these stories travel. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get into the story tonight. Your first sensation is scratchy and lumpy. You're lying on something that feels suspiciously like a burlap sack stuffed with dried grass, and it's doing a terrible job of cushioning you from the hard surface beneath. There's a disconcerting chill in the air, a dampness that seeps into your bones far more effectively than any modern central heating system could ever combat. You try to pull a blanket closer, but your hand encounters a coarse, oily wool that smells faintly of wet sheep and something else, something acrid. You haven't even opened your eyes yet, and already your body is lodging a formal complaint with management. This is not the thread count you're accustomed to. Then, the sounds begin to filter through your sleepy consciousness. At first, it's a dull, amorphous roar, like the ocean if the ocean was made of people shouting and donkeys complaining. But as you drift closer to wakefulness, individual noises detach themselves from the din. There's a rhythmic clanging, metal on stone, perhaps. The high-pitched braying of what must be a donkey, a very unhappy donkey, by the sound of it, probably protesting its early start. Dogs are barking, a chorus of them, from yappy little terriers to something deeper, more resonant. And underneath it all, a constant murmur of human voices, not the polite, hushed tones of a modern suburb waking up, but a robust, uninhibited babble. You can't make out any words. It's all a jumble of what you vaguely recognize might be some form of Latin. But the urgency and sheer volume are unmistakable. It's like waking up in the middle of a marketplace that decided to open 3 hours early, directly under your window, possibly in your room. There's no gentle ramp up to the day here. Rome, it seems, hits the ground running or perhaps shouting. You instinctively reach for your phone to hit the snooze button, but your hand just thumps against the rough floor beside your lumpy bed. No sleek glass, no comforting glow. That's your first real jolt. Snooze button? Not invented yet, pal. Your alarm clock is a donkey with an attitude and a city full of people who apparently never learned to use their inside voices. Slowly, cautiously, you crack open an eyelid. The light is dim, a gray pre-dawn filtering through what appears to be a small, unglazed window opening high up on one wall. No curtains, of course. Why would there be? That would be far too luxurious. Dust motes dance in the weak shafts of light, illuminated like tiny, ancient spirits. You can see rough, uneven walls, timber beams across a low ceiling, and not much else. This isn't just a bad motel. This is something else entirely. And then the smells hit you. Oh, the smells. If the sounds were an assault, the odors are a full-blown siege. Your nostrils are bombarded by a complex, layered bouquet that would make a modern sanitation officer weep. There's the pervasive aroma of wood smoke, which is almost pleasant, a nostalgic scent of campfires and hearths. But layered beneath that is the unmistakable, sharp tang of stale urine, so pungent it makes your eyes water. You might even catch a whiff of ammonia, because, fun factoid for your already troubled morning, the Romans were big fans of using aged pea as a cleaning agent, particularly for laundry. Yes, those toga-clad citizens walking around looking all stately? Their whites were probably whitened with something you'd pay good money to avoid stepping in. Add to this the smell of unwashed bodies, a lot of them. Judging by the density of the air, the faint, not unpleasant aroma of baking bread from somewhere nearby, mingling with the less pleasant scent of old food, maybe some rotting vegetables and something else, something fishy and salty. That's likely garum, the beloved Roman condiment made from fermented fish guts. Think of it as ancient ketchup, if ketchup had a death wish and a vendetta against your sinuses. The sheer olfactory overload is enough to make you want to burrow back under that questionable wool blanket. But the sounds are only getting louder. You sit up, the straw-filled mattress crackling in protest. Your head spins. This isn't a hangover. This isn't some elaborate prank. The cold, the sounds, the smells, they're too real, too visceral. A wave of genuine panic starts to bubble up from your stomach. Where are you? When are you? The clothes you're wearing, if you can even call them that, are a rough, shapeless tunic that feels like it's been woven from industrial-grade sandpaper. You become aware of a particular kind of noise from outside, growing in volume. A shuffling of many feet, voices calling out greetings. Not casual hellos, but more formal, almost subservient calls. It's the sound of the salutatio, the traditional morning greeting ritual where clients would flock to the houses of their wealthy patrons. Even before the sun is properly up, the city's social machinery is grinding into gear, people already hustling to maintain their connections, to beg for favors or their daily allowance. The rich Romans, the patrons, are still snug in their beds, probably, while the less fortunate are already pounding the uneven cobblestones. It's a stark reminder that this society runs on a very different set of rules and expectations. Driven by a desperate need for answers, or maybe just a desire to escape the immediate confines of your smelly sleeping spot, you stumble towards the small window. It's more of a hole in the wall, really, perhaps covered by a wooden shutter that's currently open. Peering out, your stomach lurches. You're looking down onto a narrow, winding street, already teeming with people. The buildings are tall, ramshackle affairs, leaning against each other like drunken sailors. Some are made of dark, weathered wood, others of a rough, brownish stone and brick. Balconies sag precariously, festooned with laundry and unidentifiable objects. There are no sidewalks to speak of, just a muddy, refuse-strewn lane where people, donkeys, and dogs jostle for space. Carts with solid wooden wheels rumble by, their drivers shouting. Vendors are setting up stalls, hawking goods you can't identify. The sheer, unadulterated chaos is mesmerizing and terrifying in equal measure. No familiar logos, no street signs you can read, no cars, no power lines. Just a sea of humanity in a profoundly alien landscape. Your 21st century brain struggles to process the input. It's like being dropped into a historical movie. Only the smells are real, the discomfort is acute, and there's no director to yell, "Cut." You think about your morning routine back home. The alarm, the stumble to the coffee machine, the blissful first sip of caffeine that makes the world seem manageable. Coffee. The thought itself is a cruel joke. Coffee beans are still happily growing in Ethiopia, centuries away from becoming a global obsession. You're not getting your double-shot latte with oat milk this morning, or any morning, as far as you can tell. This realization alone is almost enough to make you give up. A city this loud, this smelly, this early, and no coffee? That's just uncivilized. It's amazing anyone got anything done. Really? Perhaps that's why they were so keen on conquering everyone. They were just desperately searching for a decent cup of joe. A little joke there to lighten the mood, though your current predicament feels anything but light. The noise level is truly something else. Modern cities are loud, sure, with traffic and construction, but this is a different kind of loud. It's organic, human, and animal. Historians still debate whether the average Roman living in these densely packed residential areas, especially in districts like the Suburra, ever experienced true silence. Even at night, the city wasn't entirely quiet, with bakers grinding grain and the sounds of late-night revelers or, more ominously, the occasional scuffle or cry for help from the vigiles, the city's rudimentary police and fire brigade, who probably had their hands full. But this morning cacophony is the city in full throat, announcing the start of another relentless day. You pull back from the window, your mind reeling. Every single one of your senses is screaming that you are not in Kansas anymore, or London, or anywhere you've ever known. The reality is beginning to sink in, cold and hard as the floor beneath your bare feet. This is it. This is your new morning. No gentle transition, no welcome packet. Just a brutal, multi-sensory plunge into the deep end of the ancient Roman world. Your first few minutes awake have already been a trial by ordeal. The thought of facing an entire day of this, let alone trying to survive, is utterly daunting. Your stomach rumbles, a reminder that soon you'll have to confront another unknown, Roman breakfast. And based on the morning's olfactory offerings, you're not exactly filled with eager anticipation. The initial shock is a powerful beast, and right now it has you firmly in its grip. You just want the world to stop smelling like a petting zoo that's also a fish market and a public latrine. Is that too much to ask? Apparently, in ancient Rome, yes. Yes, it is. Well, staying in your fragrant little shoebox of a room isn't really an option. Is it? Hunger, a desperate need for some kind of orientation, or maybe just the dawning horror that this is your new reality, eventually propels you to your feet. You take a deep breath, instantly regretting it as the potent aroma of ancient Rome fills your lungs again, and decide to brave the outside world. If you're in a multi-story insula, which is highly likely given the cramped conditions, your first challenge is the stairs. Don't expect well-lit, even steps with a sturdy handrail. You're more likely to encounter a narrow, winding staircase made of crumbling wood or worn stone, shrouded in an almost Stygian gloom. Each step groans ominously under your weight, and you instinctively reach out to steady yourself against a wall that feels disconcertingly damp and slimy. You can hear the scuttling of unseen creatures, probably rats the size of small cats, disturbed by your passage. It's less a staircase and more an obstacle course designed by a particularly malevolent goblin. Finally, you emerge, blinking, onto the street level, and the scene you glimpsed from your window explodes into life with a vengeance. The volume immediately cranks up by several notches. It's a relentless tide of humanity, a chaotic, jostling, shouting, sweating, and surprisingly determined mass of people, all seemingly intent on getting somewhere very important very loudly. There's no concept of personal space here. You're immediately bumped, nudged, and squeezed as bodies press past you from all directions. It's like being caught in a mosh pit at a festival where everyone's also trying to herd livestock and sell questionable street food. Your modern sensibilities about forming an orderly queue or saying, "Excuse me," are about as useful here as a chocolate teapot. Actually, a chocolate teapot might at least be a novelty. You try to take a step, then another, attempting to blend in, or at least not get trampled. The ground beneath your feet, assuming you've been gifted some kind of rudimentary footwear, perhaps ill-fitting leather sandals, is a treacherous mess. Forget paved sidewalks and neatly asphalted roads. Many Roman streets, especially in the poorer districts, were unpaved or poorly paved with large, uneven flagstones. Dust in dry weather, thick, clinging mud when it rained. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, there's filth. We're talking rotting vegetable scraps, discarded animal bones, broken pottery, and a generous sprinkling of animal droppings from the aforementioned donkeys, plus dogs, and probably the occasional pig that's escaped its sty. And let's not forget the contents of chamber pots. With no widespread indoor plumbing, residents would often unceremoniously empty their nocturnal accumulations directly out of their windows onto the street below. You quickly learn to walk with one eye on the ground and the other looking up, nervously scanning the windows above for any ominous trickles or, heaven forbid, a sudden downpour of, well, you get the idea. It gives a whole new meaning to the phrase, watch your step. It's a wonder anyone reached their destination without needing a full decontamination shower, which, by the way, also wasn't a thing. The air, if possible, smells even worse down here. The fragrant cocktail you experienced in your room is now turbocharged with the immediate, up-close and personal stench of everything the city discards. There's a reason why wealthier Romans often held perfumed cloths to their noses when venturing out. You, unfortunately, lack such fineries. You just have to breathe it in, a constant, inescapable reminder of the city's primitive sanitation. It's the kind of smell that clings to the back of your throat, a souvenir you never asked for. You might notice, if you dare to look closely, shallow channels running down the center or sides of some streets, meant for drainage. But these were often clogged and overflowing, serving more as open sewers than effective conduits for waste. Sometimes you'll see large, raised stepping stones, the pondera, placed at intervals across the wider streets. These weren't just for decoration. They were an ingenious, if somewhat desperate, solution to allow pedestrians to cross streets that were frequently awash with rainwater, overflow from fountains, and yes, sewage, while still permitting the high-axled Roman carts to pass, their wheels straddling the stones. It's a neat bit of urban planning, a testament to Roman pragmatism, but also a rather stark indicator of just how messy things could get. You try to use one, wobbling precariously, feeling like you're playing a real-life game of the floor is lava. Except the lava is ancient Roman gunk. Then there's the traffic. Oh, the glorious, unregulated Roman traffic. Forget traffic lights, stop signs, or clearly defined lanes. It's a free-for-all. Heavy wooden carts, laden with goods, amphorae of wine or oil, sacks of grain, building materials rumble along, drawn by straining oxen or mules. Their iron-banded wheels screech and clatter on the flagstones, adding to the general din. The drivers, perched precariously, shout and crack whips, seemingly oblivious to the pedestrians scrambling to get out of their way. There are no designated pedestrian crossings. You just take your life in your hands and make a dash for it when you see a gap, or what you hope is a gap. It's like playing a game of Frogger where every vehicle is a heavily armed chariot with a driver who's late for the Colosseum. One wrong move and you could end up as an unfortunate footnote in the annals of Roman street accidents. You quickly realize that the safest place is often pressed up against a building, trying to make yourself as small as possible. And as if the physical dangers weren't enough, you also have to worry about the more human threats. Pickpockets and cut purses thrived in these crowded conditions. A moment's distraction, a careless gesture, and any valuables you might possess, though what those would be in your current state is debatable, could vanish into the throng. You see shifty-eyed individuals lurking in doorways, their gazes lingering a little too long. The concept of neighborhood watch probably consisted of yelling loudly if you saw someone else getting robbed. Even the buildings themselves seem to conspire against you. Those tall insulae are often poorly constructed, with timber frames and mud brick infill, prone to collapse or, more frequently, fire. Bits of plaster, loose tiles, or even entire window shutters might detach themselves from upper stories and come crashing down. There was actually legislation dating back to the 12 Tables, Rome's earliest codified laws from around 450 BC, that addressed liability for damage caused by things falling from buildings. So, getting beamed on the head by a rogue flower pot or something less floral was apparently enough of a problem even then to warrant a law. Comforting, isn't it? Knowing that your potential demise by falling debris has ancient legal precedent. It makes you want to invest in a sturdy helmet, if only you knew where to get one. The sheer variety of people is astounding. You see street vendors loudly hawking their wares, sizzling sausages of dubious origin, cheap wine ladled from a large cask, trinkets and amulets. Groups of legionaries, perhaps on leave, swagger through the crowd, their armor glinting. Veiled women of higher status might be carried past in litters, borne on the shoulders of sweating slaves, trying to remain aloof from the surrounding chaos. Slaves themselves are everywhere, hurrying on errands, their expressions often downcast or resigned. Foreigners from all corners of the empire, Greeks, Egyptians, Gauls, Syrians, add their own languages and distinct attire to the already bewildering mix. You try to catch snippets of conversation, but it's mostly a blur of rapid-fire vulgar Latin, with a healthy dose of shouting and gesticulation. It's a vibrant, pulsating, multicultural stew, but one you feel utterly adrift in. You are an anomaly, an outsider, and every curious glance you receive feels like a spotlight. Historians still debate the actual effectiveness of the aediles, the magistrates tasked with overseeing public works, markets, and general order in truly managing the day-to-day realities of these densely packed streets. While they certainly undertook projects and enforced some regulations, the sheer scale of a city like Rome, with its population bursting at the seams, must have made their job a Herculean, if not impossible, task. For every street they managed to get cleaned, or every dangerous building they condemned, there were probably 10 more needing urgent attention. The order in Rome was likely a very loose concept, a constant struggle against the natural entropy of a massive, ancient metropolis. You certainly don't see anyone in an official-looking uniform calmly directing traffic or handing out fines for littering. It's more like organized chaos with the emphasis heavily on the chaos. You shuffle along, trying to look like you know where you're going, even though you haven't the faintest clue. Your initial mission, find food, find answers, seems almost laughably ambitious in the face of this relentless sensory onslaught. Just surviving the next 10 minutes feels like a major achievement. Every step is a calculation of risk. Avoid that pile of refuse, dodge that oncoming cart, try not to make eye contact with that rather large, unfriendly-looking fellow with the scarred face. This isn't just a morning commute. It's a full-body, extreme immersion experience in why your comfortable, sanitized, and orderly 21st century existence has left you utterly unprepared for the raw, unfiltered reality of the ancient world. You thought rush hour on the subway was bad? That was amateur hour. This is the professional league of urban discomfort, and you've just been thrown into the championship game without a rulebook or any protective gear. Good luck, you're going to need it. Your stomach, by this point, isn't just rumbling. It's staging a full-blown protest, complete with angry gurgles and the occasional pang that feels like a tiny legionary is practicing his spear thrusts on your insides. The sensory overload of the Roman streets is one thing, but hunger adds a sharp, insistent edge to your disorientation. You need fuel and fast if you're going to make any sense of this chaotic new old world. Your eyes, now somewhat accustomed to the dim, dusty light and the sheer crush of people, begin to scan for anything resembling a food source. This is easier said than done when you don't know what ancient Roman fast food even looks like. You're not exactly going to spot a golden arch or a neon sign advertising artisanal coffee. Eventually, through the throng, you spot a small, open-fronted shop, a thermopolium, basically the Roman equivalent of a snack bar or a greasy spoon diner. It's little more than a counter facing the street, with several large pottery vessels, or dolia, embedded into it, presumably containing hot food or drinks, or at least once hot. The smells wafting from it are a mixed bag. Some savory, like roasting meat or something approximating meat, others vaguely soupy, and a general aroma of warm, slightly stale air. Nearby, a baker's stall, a pastrinum, assaults your nostrils with the more universally appealing scent of baking bread, though even that has a rougher, earthier quality than you're used to. There are also street vendors with trays of unidentifiable items, some of which look suspiciously like fried somethings. You decide to aim for the baker first. Bread seems like a safe bet. Universal, right? You approach the stall, trying to navigate the final few feet through a knot of people also apparently seeking their morning sustenance. The baker, a stout man with flour dusting his eyebrows and a generally unimpressed expression, eyes you warily. Communication is, predictably, an issue. Your desperate pointing and miming of eating eventually gets the message across. He gestures towards a selection of loaves. These aren't your fluffy, pre-sliced supermarket wonders. Roman bread was typically round, often dense, and made with coarser flour, sometimes including bits of grit from the milling process. For that authentic rustic experience, or perhaps just an unplanned dental adventure. You might even find some loaves scored into sections, making them easier to break. You point at a small, reasonably uncharred specimen. He grunts, names a price in a currency you don't possess and in a language you don't understand. This is awkward. After a moment of confused silence and more desperate gesturing towards your empty hands, perhaps unwise, advertising your poverty. He seems to take pity on you, or maybe he just wants you out of his way. With a sigh that could curdle milk, he breaks off a chunk from a slightly less appealing loaf and thrusts it at you. Charity? Or just a way to get rid of day-old bread? You're not about to question it. You retreat to a slightly less crowded doorway to inspect your prize. The bread is heavy, the crust hard. You take a bite. Substantial. Chewy. Not unpleasant, exactly, but certainly not the highlight of your culinary experiences. It tastes of wheat, yeast, and a faint smokiness from the oven. It's the kind of bread that demands serious mastication, a workout for your jaw. This is your Roman breakfast, your ientaculum. No butter, no jam, no artisanal spreads. Sometimes Romans would dip their bread in wine, yes, even for breakfast, a little something to take the edge off living in ancient Rome, perhaps. Or olive oil, or eat it with a few olives, some dates, or a hunk of cheese if they were feeling flush. For many, especially the urban poor, this piece of bread, perhaps obtained through the state-subsidized grain dole known as the kura anoni, might be the entirety of their morning meal. The annona was a massive logistical undertaking, ensuring a steady supply of grain to the capital to feed its hundreds of thousands of inhabitants, a crucial factor in maintaining social stability. That very chunk of slightly gritty bread in your hand is a direct result of a complex system of taxation, shipping, and distribution spanning the entire Mediterranean. Puts your simple breakfast into a bit of perspective, doesn't it? As you chew, you watch others. Some are munching on similar pieces of bread. Others are clustered around the thermopolium, getting small bowls of what looks like a thick porridge or gruel. This is likely pulse, a staple food in ancient Rome for centuries, especially before bread became widely common. Made from boiled spelt, wheat, or other grains, it could be savory or less commonly sweet. Think of it as the original sad beige food, the ancient ancestor of uninspired oatmeal, though sometimes it was jazzed up with bits of vegetables, cheese, or meat if you were lucky. It was cheap, filling, and probably about as exciting as watching paint dry, unless the paint was a particularly vibrant shade of imperial purple. You might also see someone eating a more unusual concoction, perhaps something they brought from home. If you were to peer into their lunch pail, metaphorically speaking, you might find a hunk of maridum. This was a rather pungent peasant-style cheese spread, made by pounding together garlic, herbs like parsley, rue, or coriander, salt, olive oil, vinegar, and cheese, often a hard sheep's or goat's milk cheese, in a mortar. The smell alone would be enough to clear a modern subway car. It was eaten with bread and was considered quite rustic. An acquired taste, you imagine, much like many things in this era. Probably not something you'd find on a brunch menu next to avocado toast. That's for sure. And what are they washing this down with? Water, if they're sensible, though the quality from public fountains could be variable. Or, as mentioned, wine usually watered down, especially in the morning. Beer was considered a bit barbaric, more of a northern provincial tipple. Your longing for a hot cup of coffee or tea is almost physically painful. Those beverages are centuries away from arriving in Europe. The concept of a warm, comforting, non-alcoholic morning drink just isn't really on the menu. It's all about a quick, functional refuel to get you through the morning. No lingering over a cappuccino and the morning paper here. The paper, if it existed, would be a wax tablet or a pricey bit of papyrus, and you probably wouldn't have time to read it anyway. The hygiene standards of these food stalls are, shall we say, not up to modern codes. The baker handles your bread with the same hands he uses for money, if you'd had any. The thermopolium counter is probably wiped down with a rag of questionable cleanliness. Flies buzz with a certain Roman entitlement. You try not to think too hard about where the water for the pulse came from, or how long those hot foods have actually been sitting in their dolia. It's a case of what you don't know can't hurt you, except it absolutely can and frequently did. Dysentery and other foodborne illnesses were rife. Your modern stomach, coddled by sanitation and refrigeration, is probably staging an internal revolt just looking at the scene. Historians still debate how much access the urban poor truly had to a varied diet, particularly fresh fruits and vegetables. While the markets would have displayed a colorful array, much of it might have been beyond the reach of those living on a subsistence income. Were their diets overwhelmingly grain-based, supplemented by whatever cheap beans or olives they could afford? Or was there more variety than the surviving texts sometimes suggest? Looking at the meager options available to you for this impromptu breakfast, you lean towards the mostly grain theory. This, then, is your fuel for the day. A hunk of dense bread that tastes mostly of survival. It's a far cry from a balanced breakfast, or even a particularly enjoyable one. It's functional, basic, and a stark reminder of the daily grind that was life for most people in this ancient superpower. No sugary cereals, no fluffy pancakes, no eggs Benedict. Just the bare necessities to stave off hunger for a few more hours. You finish your chunk of bread, crumbs clinging to your rough tunic. It sits in your stomach like a small, dense rock, an ancient Roman energy bar, perhaps, designed for slow release and even slower digestion. You're not exactly feeling energized, more like ballasted, but at least the spear-thrusting legionary in your gut has momentarily ceased his maneuvers. Now, what to do with the rest of this incredibly long, incredibly strange Roman day? The thought is exhausting, and you haven't even started work yet. That piece of rather uninspiring bread is now settling in your stomach, a dense reminder of your Roman breakfast experience. With no particular place to go and no understanding of how to get there anyway, you find your feet, almost by grim instinct, leading you back towards the building you woke up in. Your home, if you can call it that. The prospect of returning to that dingy room isn't exactly thrilling, but the streets, with their overwhelming chaos and olfactory assaults, offer no real refuge either. At least in your little cell, there's a modicum of, well, not privacy, but perhaps slightly less public exposure. As you approach the towering tenement or insula, you take a moment to really look at it from the outside, something your panicked morning self didn't fully register. It looms over the narrow alleyway, a teetering stack of floors seemingly cobbled together from mismatched materials, patches of rough brickwork, exposed wooden beams that look suspiciously weathered, and sections of what might be wattle and daub, essentially mud and sticks, which doesn't inspire confidence in its structural integrity. It leans slightly, like a very tired old man contemplating a nap, and you can't help but wonder if it's leaning on the adjacent building, or if they're both engaged in a slow, mutual collapse. Some of the window openings are just dark squares. Others have rickety wooden shutters, a few of which hang precariously by a single hinge. That balcony on the third floor looks like it's holding on by pure spite and a couple of rusty nails. You make a mental note not to stand under it. Ever. The ground floor of your insula, and many like it, might actually house taberni, small shops or workshops opening directly onto the street. You might see a cobbler hammering away, a vendor selling watered-down wine from a dusty amphora, or even a cook shop with its own unique blend of smells adding to the street's potent perfume. These shopkeepers often lived in cramped quarters behind or above their businesses. It's an interesting factoid that the upper floors of these insulae were generally considered less desirable. The higher you went, the cheaper the rent, but the greater the inconvenience and danger. More stairs to climb, an exhausting prospect in a 5- or 6-story building with no elevator. No running water, that was usually only available on the ground floor, if at all. Hotter in the summer as heat rose, colder in the winter, and, crucially, much harder to escape from in case of fire or, Jupiter forbid, collapse. So, your little perch high up in the building? Prime real estate for the truly desperate or the astonishingly poor. You navigate the dark, treacherous stairwell once more. The air thick with the smells of stale cooking, damp, and unidentifiable human habitation. The steps creak and groan under your weight, and you place each foot with the care of a bomb disposal expert. You pass other doorways, some covered with a tattered curtain, from behind which you hear muffled arguments, the crying of a baby, or the hacking cough of someone who's clearly not enjoying Rome's famously healthy air. So much for that slightly less public exposure. Finally, you reach your room, your sanctuary, your haven. Okay, maybe not. It's exactly as you left it. Small, dim, and profoundly depressing. The single unglazed window offers a sliver of gray light and a symphony of street noise. The lumpy bed in the corner looks even less inviting now that you're fully awake. For furniture, apart from the bed, there might be a rickety wooden stool and perhaps a small, battered chest that probably wouldn't deter a particularly determined mouse, let alone a Roman thief. There are no closets, no drawers, just the bare, uneven floor and those oppressive walls. You try to imagine living here, truly living. Where would you put your, well, anything? Personal belongings seem like a liability, an encumbrance. The concept of cozy studio apartment, this is not. This is more like grim survival pod with questionable structural soundness. And the dangers. Oh, the ever-present dangers of insula life. The most terrifying and most common was fire. These buildings were tinder boxes, constructed largely of wood, packed tightly together, and filled with people using open braziers for heating and cooking, and oil lamps for light. It was a recipe for disaster. A stray spark, a knocked-over lamp, and your entire building could go up in flames in minutes. And with no organized fire department as you know it, the vigilas did their best, but they were often outmatched. And no easy escape route from the upper floors. A fire was a death sentence for many. You can't help but think of the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, during Nero's reign. It raged for 6 days, destroying vast swathes of the city, consuming countless insulae just like this one. While Nero famously, or infamously, used the opportunity to rebuild parts of the city on a grander scale. For the thousands left homeless or perished in the flames, it was an unimaginable catastrophe. Living here, you'd sleep with one ear constantly open for the crackle of flames or the shouts of fire. It's not exactly conducive to a restful night. The Roman fire safety plan seemed to consist mainly of wishful thinking and maybe having a bucket of dubious water handy. Good luck with that against an inferno. Then there's the risk of collapse. These buildings were often shoddily constructed by speculative landlords looking to maximize profit by cramming as many tenants as possible into poorly built structures. They'd add extra stories illegally, used substandard materials, and cut corners wherever they could. Creaks, groans, and strange settling noises would be your constant companions. You'd eye every crack in the wall with suspicion, wondering if this was the day the whole thing decided to return to its component parts, with you somewhere inside. Historians still debate the average height of Roman insulae and the extent to which building regulations, such as those purportedly introduced by Augustus and later emperors like Nero after the Great Fire, were actually enforced. Looking around your current abode, you'd probably guess not very effectively. The landlord probably described this place as having character, which you now correctly interpret as possessing a high probability of imminent structural failure. And if fire or collapse didn't get you, disease was always waiting in the wings. The lack of sanitation, the overcrowding, the proximity to filth, it was a breeding ground for illnesses. With no running water in your room, personal hygiene would be a challenge. Shared latrines, if the building even had them, were likely foul and rarely cleaned. Otherwise, it was back to the trusty chamber pot and the window emptying technique you observed earlier. Not exactly a recipe for good health. The sheer lack of privacy is another thing. The walls are thin. You can hear your neighbors arguing, their children crying, their other activities. They, in turn, can hear you. Every cough, every sneeze, every muttered curse at your miserable living conditions is public knowledge. It's like living in a very large, very dysfunctional share house where no one ever does the dishes and everyone snores. Forget quiet contemplation or a moment to yourself. Your room is less a personal space and more a temporary holding cell with slightly better ventilation than an actual dungeon. Maybe you sit on the edge of the lumpy bed, the rough wool of your tunic scratching your skin, the sounds of the city, the smells from the alley, the oppressive smallness of the room, the constant, gnawing awareness of danger. It all combines into a heavy weight on your spirit. This isn't just a place to sleep. It's a daily reminder of your precarious existence. There's no comfort here, no real security. Just four walls, hopefully four, and hopefully still standing tomorrow, and a roof that hopefully doesn't leak too much. It's a stark contrast to any concept of home you've ever known. Your apartment or house back in your own time, with its solid walls, its clean running water, its electricity, its comfortable bed, suddenly seems like an unimaginable palace of luxury. Here, in this Roman slum, survival is the name of the game, and your living quarters are just another obstacle on the course. You sigh, a sound lost in the general din. The day has barely begun, and you're already exhausted. The grim reality of your Roman insula accommodation settles upon you like the ever-present dust. That chunk of bread you had for breakfast won't last forever, and the charitable baker isn't likely to make a habit of feeding stray, bewildered individuals. You need denarii, or whatever the local walking around money is called. You need to earn your keep, as they say. Which means, dear listener, you need a job. And in ancient Rome, if you're unskilled, unknown, and look like you've just been dragged through a historical hedge backwards, which essentially you have, your career options are going to be somewhat limited. Think less fulfilling career path with opportunities for advancement, and more backbreaking labor that might just earn you enough for another piece of bread. So, with a heavy heart and an even heavier sense of foreboding, you venture back out into the teeming, noisy streets. Where does one even begin to look for work in this ancient metropolis? There are no job centers, no online listings, no help-wanted signs written in a language you can comprehend. You wander, trying to look purposeful, observing the hive of activity. You see men hauling heavy sacks at the riverside port on the Tiber, others chipping away at stone in dusty construction sites, and still others running errands for shops or wealthier households. The air is thick with the shouts of foremen, the clang of tools, and the general groan of human effort. It's clear that Rome runs on muscle power, animal and human. and there seems to be a lot of it needed. Your best bet, you figure, is to find a place where lots of manual labor is happening and just try to look available. Maybe a new temple is going up, or an aqueduct being repaired. Rome was, after all, a city of perpetual construction. Emperor Augustus famously boasted that he found Rome a city of bricks and left it a city of marble. That transformation, and countless others like it under subsequent emperors, required mountains of stone, forests of timber, and an army of laborers. You might not be carving delicate Corinthian capitals, but they surely need someone to carry the marble, right? Eventually, you find yourself near a sprawling construction site. It's a chaotic ballet of dust, noise, and sweat. Men, stripped to the waist, their bodies gleaming with perspiration and caked with grime, are everywhere. Some are digging foundations, others are mixing mortar that looks suspiciously like wet concrete, and a large group is engaged in the Sisyphean task of carrying heavy baskets of rubble and hods of bricks up rickety wooden ramps. An overseer, a burly fellow with a voice like a foghorn and a stick he isn't afraid to use for pointing, or perhaps whacking, is bellowing instructions. This looks promising, or at least like a place that might trade extreme physical exertion for a few coins. You hover near the edge, trying to catch someone's eye. The job interview process is refreshingly simple. The overseer spots you, looks you up and down with an expression that suggests he's appraising livestock, and barks something incomprehensible, accompanied by a pointed gesture towards a pile of empty baskets and then towards a rapidly growing mound of excavated earth. The message is clear. Can you lift that? Good. You're hired. Or at least, you're temporarily tolerated. There's no paperwork, no discussion of terms, no mention of an employee benefits package, unless you count the benefit of not starving immediately as a perk, which, in this context, it probably is. And so begins your new Roman grind. You pick up a basket, noting its rough weave and surprising weight even when empty. You join the line of other laborers, a shuffling, weary-looking bunch, and start filling it with dirt and rocks. Then comes the fun part, hauling it up a steep, unstable ramp to dump it onto a growing spoil heap. The basket cuts into your uncalloused hands. The sun beats down mercilessly. Dust fills your nostrils and coats your tongue. Your back, unaccustomed to this kind of toil, begins to scream in protest after only a few trips. Your Roman Fitbit, if such a miraculous device existed, would be off the charts before lunchtime. If lunchtime was even a recognized concept here beyond a brief pause to gnaw on some more bread. The work is mind-numbingly repetitive and physically exhausting. There's no skill involved, just brute force and endurance. You watch the other workers. Some are slaves, their movements listless, their eyes empty. Others are freeborn poor like yourself, their faces etched with the daily struggle for survival. There's little conversation, just the grunts of effort, the thud of dumped loads, and the constant bellowing of the overseer, whose motivational techniques seem to consist primarily of shouting, creative threats involving your ancestry, and the occasional prod with his stick if someone slows down too much. It's HR management, Roman style. Safety precautions? What are those? There are no hard hats, no steel-toed boots, no safety harnesses. Men are working high up on rickety scaffolding with nothing between them and a nasty fall but a prayer to Jupiter. You see a worker stumble, nearly sending a cascade of bricks onto the heads of those below. He's met with a string of curses from the overseer, not concerned for his well-being. An injury here doesn't mean paid sick leave and a workers' comp claim. It means you're out of a job, unable to earn, and probably in a great deal of trouble. You quickly learn to be very, very careful, your senses on high alert for any potential danger, adding another layer of stress to the already grueling labor. As you toil, you might overhear some of the more seasoned workers talking about collegia. These were associations or guilds, often for specific trades or crafts, like the bakers, the boatmen, or the silversmiths. Some collegia were essentially social clubs or burial societies, ensuring their members received a proper funeral, which was a big deal to the Romans. While these weren't unions in the modern sense, fighting for wages or conditions, they did provide a sense of community and mutual support for their members. For unskilled, day-to-day laborers like yourself, however, such organized support is likely out of reach. You're on your own, a tiny, replaceable cog in Rome's massive labor machine. At the end of what feels like an eternity, but was probably just a typical Roman workday stretching from sunup to nearly sundown, the overseer calls a halt. You're covered in grime. Your muscles ache with a profound, deep-seated weariness you've never known, and your hands are raw. You join the queue of other exhausted laborers, and the overseer, after consulting a wax tablet, doles out a few small bronze coins into your palm. It's a pitifully small amount, barely enough, you suspect, for another meal and perhaps a share of that miserable room. This is it. This is your reward for a day of soul-crushing labor. Historians still debate the exact percentage of Rome's population that constituted the idle mob, supposedly placated by bread and circuses, versus those engaged in regular, if poorly compensated, labor. Looking around at your fellow workers, their faces grim with fatigue, you have a strong suspicion that the idle mob theory might be a bit overstated. Someone had to build those magnificent temples and aqueducts, unload those ships, and keep the city functioning. And that someone looks a lot like the exhausted, dirt-streaked reflection you'd see if there was a clean puddle nearby. You stumble away from the construction site, your body protesting every step. The vibrant, chaotic energy of the Roman streets now seems less like a fascinating spectacle and more like a cruel mockery of your own depleted state. The thought of having to do this again tomorrow and the day after and the day after that just to survive is a truly sobering one. Your first day on the Roman job market has been a brutal introduction to the realities of life for the vast majority of the city's inhabitants. There's no glory here, no marble statues being erected in your honor. Just the dull ache of overexerted muscles, the sting of blisters, and the gnawing uncertainty of where your next meal will come from. Welcome to the working class Roman edition. You've earned your pittance. Now try to find the energy to spend it wisely. Clutching the few, meager coins from your day of backbreaking labor, you drag your aching body through the streets of Rome as dusk begins to settle. The city's cacophony softens slightly, but it's replaced by the flickering, uncertain light of oil lamps from shops and windows, casting long, dancing shadows that make the familiar streets seem even more alien and menacing. Your immediate concern is food, and then the grim prospect of returning to your shared hovel in the insula. But as you move through the city, another, more insidious realization begins to dawn, a truth more crushing than the physical exhaustion. Your place in this world, or rather, your profound lack of one. You start to notice, really notice, the people around you. It's not just a faceless mass anymore. You see the subtle and not-so-subtle differences. A wealthy merchant, his tunic made of finer wool, perhaps even tinged with an expensive dye, bustles past with an air of self-importance, a couple of slaves trailing in his wake carrying his purchases. He doesn't even glance at you, a grimy laborer. Why would he? You're practically part of the scenery, like a particularly uninteresting cobblestone. Then, a senator, his toga and almost blinding white, you briefly wonder if they have some secret Roman bleach, or just a lot of slaves working with that potent urine-based detergent we discussed, is carried by in a litter, his face a mask of haughty disdain for the common thoroughfare. His litter-bearers, sweating and straining, are clearly slaves, their movements precise, their expressions carefully neutral. Pedestrians scramble to make way, a wave of deference rippling through the crowd. You, of course, press yourself against a wall, lest you accidentally impede his lordship's progress and earn a lashing from one of his attendants. Your attempts at networking in this town would probably involve accidentally bumping into a noble's litter and getting thoroughly reprimanded, if not worse. It becomes chillingly clear that Roman society isn't just a collection of people. It's a rigid, sharply defined pyramid, and you, my friend, are somewhere very, very near the bottom, probably clinging on by your fingernails. This isn't some egalitarian utopia where everyone has a fair shot. This is a world of haves and have-nots, of privileged and profoundly unprivileged, and the lines are drawn as sharply as if by a chisel on stone. At the very top, you have the senatorial elite, the senators. These are the old money families, immensely wealthy landowners who dominate the political landscape. Below them, the equites or equestrian class form another layer of the aristocracy. Often wealthy through business, trade, and public contracts, they're the new money, sometimes rivaling senators in riches but not always in prestige, though their influence is undeniable. These are the people whose grand houses, the domus, with their private courtyards, mosaics, and frescoes, are hidden away from the squalor of the streets you inhabit. You might catch a glimpse through a heavily guarded gateway, a flash of opulence that seems a universe away from your own reality. Then there's the vast mass of the plebs, the common people. But even this is stratified. There are the respectable plebeians, the shopkeepers, the skilled artisans, the small business owners. They might own a bit of property, have some savings, and enjoy the rights of Roman citizenship with a degree of comfort. They are the backbone of the city's economy. And then there are the humiliors, the more humble ones. That's where you fit in. The day laborers, the unskilled workers, the perpetually poor, living hand to mouth, dependent on the whims of employers or the state's grain dole. Your social credit score, if Rome had such a thing, would be hovering dangerously close to zero. Below even the poorest freeborn citizen are the freedmen and freedwomen, the liberti and liberti. These are former slaves who have, through various means, purchase, meritorious service, or the will of their master, gained their freedom. Some freedmen became incredibly wealthy and influential, much to the chagrin of the old aristocracy. However, they often carried the stigma of their former servitude. You might see a man walking with a certain quiet pride, wearing a distinctive conical felt cap called a pileus. This was the symbol of his manumission, a public declaration of his free status. It's a poignant sight, a reminder that even in this rigid society, some movement was possible, though often hard one. Their children, born free, could often integrate more fully into society. And then, forming the very foundation upon which this whole glittering, grimy edifice is built, are the slaves, the servi. They are everywhere, not just toiling in the fields or mines, but in every household of means, in every shop, on every construction site. They are cooks, cleaners, tutors, scribes, hairdressers, gladiators. They are property with no rights, subject entirely to the will of their owners. You see them being ordered about, sometimes with casual indifference, sometimes with outright cruelty. A sharp word, a blow, a dismissive gesture. It's all part of the accepted order. While your own situation as a free but impoverished laborer is grim, you at least possess your person, your freedom to walk away, though to where, and to what is another question. Slaves do not have that luxury. The sheer ubiquity of slavery is a constant, unsettling backdrop to Roman life. It normalizes exploitation in a way that is deeply disturbing to your modern sensibilities. You recall dimly from your history lessons talk of reformers like the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, who, way back in the 2nd century BC, tried to enact land reforms and champion the cause of the plebeians against the encroachments of the wealthy elite. Their efforts ended tragically for them, but they highlighted the deep-seated social and economic tensions that simmered beneath the surface of Roman society, even as it expanded into a vast empire. Those tensions haven't vanished. They've just evolved. The rich are still very rich, and the poor are still very poor, and the gap between them is a chasm. Historians still debate the degree of social mobility possible for the lower strata of Roman society, particularly for those without initial capital or influential patronage. Could someone like you, through hard work and luck, climb this daunting social ladder? Perhaps. Stories existed of individuals rising from obscurity. But looking around at the entrenched privilege, the systemic disadvantages, it feels like that ladder is missing most of its rungs, and the few that remain are heavily greased. For most, their birth station was their destiny. This dawning understanding of the Roman social order is a profound reality check. It's not just about physical hardship anymore. It's about your inherent worth or lack thereof in the eyes of this society. You are insignificant, easily replaceable, a speck of dust in the grand machinery of Rome. If you got sick, if you were injured, if you simply couldn't find work, who would care? There's no social safety net for you, no welfare state beyond the bread dole, if you could even access it. Your freedom, while precious, feels fragile, constantly overshadowed by the desperation of your circumstances. This isn't a game you can easily win by playing by the rules, because the rules are heavily stacked against you from the start. Your experience of Rome is going to be fundamentally different from that of a wealthy tourist strolling through the Forum, marveling at the architecture. You're seeing the underbelly, the engine room, the part that isn't usually featured in the glossy brochures. And it's a sobering, disheartening view. The social chute is a much more accurate description for your likely trajectory than any kind of ladder. It's a long way down and very few handholds on the way up. That crushing awareness of your lowly spot on Rome's social totem pole, which settled on you yesterday like a poorly woven, itchy blanket, has some rather immediate and unsettling practical implications. It's not just about who gets the better seat at the Colosseum or the first pick of slightly less gritty bread. It's about your fundamental safety, your ability to navigate this sprawling, indifferent city without becoming just another unfortunate statistic. You quickly learn that in Rome, law and order are concepts that tend to apply differently depending on who you are, and for someone like you, a nobody, a speck of plebeian dust, it's best to keep your head down. Literally and metaphorically. Your modern sensibilities might lead you to expect some kind of police presence, a comforting figure in uniform you can turn to if things go sideways. You can abandon that thought right now. There's no Roman equivalent of dialing 911, no friendly neighborhood Bobby on the beat. The closest thing Rome has to a police force are the vigiles urbani, the watchmen of the city. But their primary role, and the one they were originally formed for, is firefighting. Remember those lovely, flammable insuli we talked about? Yeah, the vigiles were the guys rushing in with buckets and axes when one went up like a Roman candle. They did have some nighttime policing duties, trying to keep a lid on nocturnal crime, but they were often ill-equipped, not particularly well-trained for policing, and spread thinly across a massive, densely populated city. Think less highly trained law enforcement and more enthusiastic amateurs with water buckets and a vague mandate to stop people from stabbing each other after dark. Their main crime-fighting tool sometimes seemed to be a stern look and hoping the miscreants would just get bored and go home. Then you have the urban cohorts, the cohorts urbani. These guys were more serious, a proper paramilitary force stationed in the city to maintain public order. But their job was less about preventing petty theft or resolving your drunken brawl with a neighbor, and more about riot control, guarding public buildings, and generally making sure the emperor didn't wake up to a revolution on his doorstep. You wouldn't call them for a stolen purse. You'd see them if a bread riot was kicking off, or if rival chariot factions decided to take their sporting disagreements to the streets with more than just harsh language. And the Praetorian Guard? Forget them. They were the emperor's elite bodyguards, far too busy protecting the imperial personage to worry about your lost sandals. So, what happens when your purse is stolen, or when that disagreement with your neighbor over who gets to use the communal, and probably horrifying, latrine escalates? Mostly, you're on your own. Self-help was the order of the day. If someone wronged you, it was largely up to you, your family, or your friends to seek redress. This could mean a shouting match, a fist fight, or, if things got really out of hand, a full-blown feud. You might see a scuffle break out in the marketplace over a disputed sale, or a more serious fight spill out of a dimly lit tavern, fueled by cheap wine and ancient grudges. Often, no one in any official capacity intervenes unless it gets too loud or too bloody and threatens to disturb the wider peace. The Roman concept of neighborhood watch probably involved watching your neighbor get robbed and quietly thanking Jupiter it wasn't you this time. One evening, as you're trying to navigate a particularly dark and narrow alleyway, a shortcut you instantly regret taking, you might witness this firsthand. Perhaps you hear a sudden cry, a thud, and then the sound of running feet. Peering cautiously around a corner, you see a figure sprawled on the ground, groaning, while another shadowy form disappears into the gloom. No vigilas rush to the scene. No one else seems to want to get involved. The victim is left to pick themselves up or not, as the case may be. It's a stark lesson. The streets, especially after dark, belong to those bold or desperate enough to take what they want. And if you, by some misfortune, found yourself on the wrong side of the law, or even as a victim trying to seek justice, that's when your social status, or lack thereof, would really bite you. The Roman legal system was not a blindfolded lady holding scales. Oh no, it had its eyes wide open, and it looked very favorably upon the wealthy and well-connected, the honestiores, the more honorable ones. They could afford lawyers, they knew the right people, they could offer a timely bribe. For them, a crime might result in a fine, or perhaps a comfortable exile to a pleasant Mediterranean island. But for the humiliores, the lower classes like yourself, the justice was far swifter and infinitely more brutal. Flogging, condemnation to the mines, a virtual death sentence, crucifixion, a particularly nasty and public way to go, or being thrown to the wild beasts in the arena for public entertainment. These were the common punishments for common folk. Due process for the poor often felt more like, you're due for a beating, and we'll process the paperwork later, maybe. Emperor Augustus, in an attempt to bring some order to the chaos, enacted a series of laws, including the Lex Julia Divi Publica et Privata, aimed at curbing public and private violence, armed robbery, and riots. The very existence of such laws tells you these were significant problems. But passing a law in Rome and enforcing it effectively across every grimy alley and crowded tenement were two very different things, especially when the enforcement mechanisms were so limited. You might see a patrol of vigilas at night, moving with a clatter of their equipment. It's an odd factoid that these watchmen, equipped primarily for firefighting, would carry axes and hooks, useful for pulling down burning structures, but also serving as rather intimidating implements if they needed to break up a brawl or apprehend a suspect. Their buckets of water, while primarily for dousing flames, could also be employed to, well, dampen enthusiasm for further troublemaking, one supposes. Still, their presence often felt more symbolic than truly preventative. Historians still debate how pervasive everyday crime truly was in the crowded neighborhoods of Rome, and how much the literary sources, often written by elites who perhaps lived in safer areas or had bodyguards, exaggerated the dangers for dramatic or moralizing effect. But from your worm's eye view, crouched in your hovel or scurrying through dimly lit streets, the perception of danger is very real. It dictates your movements, your interactions. You learn to make yourself inconspicuous, to avoid eye contact with rough-looking individuals, to steer clear of dicey areas, especially after sundown when the streets largely empty of respectable folk and are given over to more shadowy pursuits. You clutch your few coins tightly, hoping no one notices the bulge they make. The overall feeling is one of profound insecurity. There's no safety net, no reliable authority to turn to. Justice is a luxury, an abstract concept for poets and philosophers. For you, survival means vigilance, avoidance, and a healthy dose of fear. Keeping your head down isn't just advice. It's a survival strategy in a city where the law is a blunt instrument, often wielded by the powerful against the weak, and where the shadows can hide a multitude of dangers. So, you're learning to navigate the treacherous currents of Roman street life, keeping your head down, trying to avoid becoming an unwilling participant in someone else's drama or a target for opportunistic crime. Life is a grim, day-to-day struggle, but Rome, for all its grit and danger, also knows how to throw a party. A very large, very loud, and often very bloody party. These are the ludi, the public games, a cornerstone of Roman life, and sooner or later, you're going to find yourself experiencing them, whether out of morbid curiosity, a desperate need for distraction, or simply because you get swept along by the sheer tidal wave of humanity heading towards one of the massive entertainment venues. One day, the usual cacophony of the city seems amplified, charged with a different kind of energy. Hawkers are louder, crowds are more purposeful, and there's a buzz of anticipation in the air. Perhaps there's a special occasion, an imperial anniversary, a religious festival, or maybe just because the emperor feels like currying some favor with the masses. This is the infamous bread and circuses, panem et circenses, the idea that keeping the populace fed, remember that grain dole, and entertained will keep them docile and distracted from their often miserable lives. And today, the circus's part is in full swing. You find yourself drawn towards the colossal bulk of an amphitheater, perhaps even the Flavian amphitheater itself, the one you know as the Colosseum. Its sheer scale is breathtaking, a mountain of stone and arches that dwarfs everything around it. Even from a distance, the roar of the crowd inside is a physical presence, a deep, guttural sound that vibrates in your chest. Or maybe it's the Circus Maximus, an even larger arena dedicated to the heart-stopping thrill of chariot races. Either way, the experience is going to be memorable. Let's say today, it's the amphitheater, the place of sand and blood. Getting in, if you're part of the common plebs, means finding your designated entrance, a vomitorium, a rather aptly named passageway designed to spew forth vast numbers of people into the seating areas. The cheap seats, naturally, are way up at the top, under the blazing sun or the occasional drizzle, offering a bird's-eye view of the proceedings, but a distant one. Still, the atmosphere is electric. Tens of thousands of people are packed in, a sea of faces, all focused on the oval arena below. The air is thick with the smell of sweat, cheap wine, and anticipation. Vendors move through the crowd selling snacks, roasted chickpeas perhaps, or sweet pastries, and, of course, more wine. It's a party atmosphere, albeit one with a distinctly lethal undercurrent. The day's entertainment often begins with the venations, the wild beast hunts. Exotic animals from the furthest reaches of the empire, lions, tigers, bears, elephants, rhinos, crocodiles are pitted against each other or against specially trained beast fighters called bestiarii. It's a brutal, bloody spectacle. You might see a magnificent lion, confused and enraged, eventually brought down by a hail of spears, or a pack of hounds savaging a cornered bear. It's a display of Rome's power over nature, its ability to bring the fiercest creatures of the known world to its arena to die for the amusement of its citizens. Your modern sensibilities, accustomed to wildlife documentaries and conservation efforts, will likely recoil in horror. This isn't a zoo. It's a slaughterhouse with stadium seating. Then come the main events, the gladiatorial contests or munera. These aren't just random brawls. They're highly ritualized duels between trained combatants, each specializing in different types of weaponry and armor. You'll see the heavily armed Murmillo with his large shield and fish-crested helmet, perhaps pitted against a nimble Retiarius, who fights with a trident, a dagger, and a weighted net, trying to entangle his opponent. There's the secutor, the chaser, specifically designed to fight the retiarius, or the Thracian with his curved sword and small shield. Before they fight, they parade into the arena, decked out in their gleaming armor, saluting the emperor or the presiding magistrate with the famous, though possibly not universally used, phrase, Ave Imperator Morituri Salutant. Hail, Emperor. Those who are about to die salute you. Talk about pressure on your workday. The combat itself is fast, brutal, and skillful. These men are athletes, warriors, entertainers. The crowd roars its approval at a well-aimed blow, gasps at a near miss, and bays for blood when a gladiator is wounded and falls. This is where your stomach might really start to churn. The sight of blood on the sand, the cries of pain, the life or death struggle played out before your eyes. It's a visceral experience, far removed from any action movie or video game. There's no CGI here, no stunt doubles. The injuries are real, the consequences permanent. When a gladiator is defeated and at the mercy of his opponent, all eyes turn to the giver of the games, often the emperor himself or a high-ranking official. The crowd plays its part, roaring their desires. Spare him, thumbs up, or perhaps a closed fist with thumb inside, a gesture of mercy, or finish him, thumbs down, or a gesture indicating a throat slit. The fate of a man's life rests on the whim of the crowd and the decision of one powerful individual. Historians still debate the true level of enthusiasm versus coerced attendance for the more brutal spectacles, and whether the thumbs-down gesture universally meant death. Regardless of the exact gesture, the power dynamic is terrifyingly clear. You might find yourself caught up in the moment, yelling along with the crowd, only to feel a cold wave of revulsion at your own bloodlust afterwards. The scale of these games could be immense. When the Colosseum was inaugurated by Emperor Titus in 80 AD, the opening games reportedly lasted for 100 days, with thousands of gladiators fighting and countless animals slaughtered. It was an almost unimaginable display of imperial largesse and Roman spectacle. And while many gladiators were slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals forced to fight, it's an odd fact that some were octorati, free men who voluntarily signed up to become gladiators, often driven by debt, a desire for fame, or perhaps a thirst for adrenaline. There were even, very rarely, female gladiators, gladiatrices, though their appearances were often controversial and considered somewhat scandalous by traditionalists. The souvenirs you could get at these events probably wouldn't be fluffy toys or team pennants. More like, my folks went to the Colosseum, and all I got was this lingering sense of existential dread and a sudden aversion to sand. The halftime show, if there was one, might involve public executions, where condemned criminals, Noxii, were dispatched in increasingly inventive and gruesome ways, perhaps forced to reenact a myth with a predictably fatal ending, or simply thrown to the still hungry beasts. This wasn't just punishment. It was a theatrical warning to the populace. Your local sports fans, with their face paint and team chants, suddenly look like a very calm and well-adjusted knitting circle by comparison. If the amphitheater isn't your cup of tea, perhaps the chariot races at the Circus Maximus would be more to your liking. Or, more accurately, just as dangerous and chaotic, but with horses. For factions, the reds, whites, blues, and greens inspired fanatical devotion, not unlike modern sports teams, but with even higher stakes. The charioteers, often slaves or freedmen seeking fame and fortune, risked life and limb navigating their light, flimsy chariots around the track, 7 grueling laps. Crashes, or naufragia, literally shipwrecks, were frequent and often fatal, with tangled reins and flying debris. The roar of up to 150,000 spectators urging on their favorite team would have been deafening. Whether it's the clang of steel in the arena or the thunder of hooves on the racetrack, Roman entertainment is not for the faint of heart. It's loud, it's visceral, and it's often lethal. It exposes you to a level of violence and a casual acceptance of suffering that is profoundly alien. This is how a superpower keeps its citizens entertained and, perhaps, a little too distracted to think about the less savory aspects of their daily lives. As you leave the arena, ears ringing, senses overloaded, you might ponder the kind of society that finds its fun in such brutal displays. It's a long way from Netflix and chill, that's for sure. After the adrenaline dump of the arena, or perhaps just as a cumulative result of the questionable food, the filthy water, the backbreaking labor, and the generally stressful ambience of ancient Rome, you start to feel off. Maybe it begins with a scratchy throat, a persistent cough that rattles your ribs, or perhaps it's a fever that leaves you alternating between shivering fits and burning sweats in your lumpy straw bed. It could be a nasty stomach bug, a direct consequence of that interesting street food you tentatively sampled. Whatever the ailment, that familiar modern urge to pop a couple of painkillers, drink plenty of fluids, and consult DR. Google, who, in this era, is probably just a particularly dusty scroll with some very bad advice, is not an option. Getting sick in ancient Rome is an entirely different and far more terrifying ball game. Your first instinct might be to ignore it. Walk it off, as they say, but as your symptoms worsen and your already meager energy reserves plummet, a cold dread begins to set in. There are no sick days with pay here. If you can't work, you don't eat. And if this illness, whatever it is, takes a serious turn, you're in a world of trouble. So, reluctantly, you decide you have to seek some kind of medical help. The question is, where do you find it, and can you even afford it? If you were a wealthy Roman, you'd have a personal physician, likely a Greek, who would attend to you in the comfort of your domus. These doctors, particularly those who followed the teachings of Hippocrates or, later in the empire, Galen, might offer relatively sensible advice based on humoral theory. The idea that health depended on the balance of 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. They'd prescribe rest, changes in diet, perhaps some herbal remedies. But you, my friend, are not a wealthy Roman. Your access to healthcare is going to be considerably more rustic. You might ask around in your insula or at the market. Someone might point you towards a local medicus whose shop is little more than a dingy room, or perhaps a stall in the marketplace where a self-proclaimed healer dispenses wisdom and dubious concoctions. There were also temples dedicated to healing gods, like Asclepius or Aesculapius to the Romans, where the sick would go to pray, offer sacrifices, and sometimes sleep in special dormitories in hopes of receiving a divine cure in their dreams. But that requires faith and possibly an offering you can't afford. Let's say you find your way to one of these marketplace healers. The clinic is likely a chaotic affair, with other hopeful patients milling about, the air thick with the smell of herbs, incense, and unwashed bodies. The healer, perhaps an old woman with knowing eyes or a man with a theatrical flair, will listen to your description of symptoms, conveyed through much gesturing and your rudimentary, heavily accented attempts at Latin. They might peer at your tongue, feel your forehead, and then pronounce a diagnosis with grave authority. It's probably something about an imbalance of your humors, or perhaps a malevolent spirit has taken up residence in your gut. Then comes the treatment plan. Forget antibiotics or antiviral medications. Those are millennia away. You're more likely to be offered a bewildering array of options. Herbal remedies are common. Infusions of various plants, some of which might actually have mild medicinal properties, like willow bark, a source of salicin similar to aspirin, while others are completely inert, and a few could be downright poisonous if administered incorrectly. You might be advised to adjust your diet, though your current diet of whatever stale bread you can find doesn't leave much room for adjustment. And then there are the more robust interventions. Bloodletting was a very popular treatment for a vast range of ailments, the idea being to remove excess or bad blood and restore humoral balance. This could involve leeches, yes, take 2 leeches and call me in the morning might have been closer to actual advice than you think, or direct venesection, where a vein was cut to allow blood to flow. Given the lack of understanding about infection, this procedure, even if it didn't weaken you further, carried a high risk of introducing new and exciting pathogens into your system. Purging through emetics to induce vomiting or laxatives to clear the bowels was another go-to treatment to expel those troublesome humors. Fun times. You might also encounter some truly bizarre ingredients in prescribed remedies. It's an odd factoid that some Roman medical texts recommended things like gladiator's blood or liver for treating epilepsy, believing the vitality of the gladiator could be transferred. Crocodile dung was sometimes used in pessaries as a contraceptive. Its effectiveness and user experience are highly debatable. The murky potion the healer is offering you with extreme suspicion. What exactly is in that? Is that mud? Or something worse? The cure, you fear, might indeed be worse than the disease. A Roman doctor's second opinion sometimes felt like it would just be, "Yep, you're definitely going to die. That'll be another 5 denarii, please." Roman surgery, surprisingly, could be quite advanced in certain areas. They had specialized instruments, scalpels, forceps, probes, catheters, some of which look remarkably similar to their modern counterparts. Roman surgeons could set broken bones, perform amputations, though with a terrifying mortality rate from shock and infection, remove bladder stones, and even operate on cataracts. Some even practice trepanation, drilling holes in the skull, possibly to relieve pressure or, in some belief systems, to release evil spirits. The idea of someone coming at your head with a drill without proper anesthesia, beyond copious amounts of wine or opium if you were lucky, and with no concept of sterilizing their tools, is enough to make your current fever seem like a minor inconvenience. The joke about a Roman headache cure being a good trepanning to let the evil spirits, and possibly your brains, out hits a little too close to home. Hygiene during any medical procedure, or even a basic examination, would be appalling by your standards. The healer's hands are probably not clean. The instruments, if any are used, are likely wiped on a dirty rag between patients. The link between dirt and disease simply wasn't understood. Infection was rampant and often the true killer, even if the initial ailment or injury wasn't life-threatening. The sheer vulnerability of the Roman population to disease was starkly illustrated by events like the Antonine Plague in the 2nd century AD. Likely smallpox or measles brought back by troops from the east, it swept through the empire, killing millions, perhaps as much as 1/4 to 1/3 of the population in some areas. Roman medicine was largely helpless in the face of such an epidemic, relying on prayers, sacrifices, and largely ineffective public health measures. Historians still debate the average life expectancy in ancient Rome, with estimates varying widely depending on social class, location, and period, but it was undeniably much lower than in modern times, especially for infants and children. For someone in your position without wealth or access to the best or least worst care, a serious illness could very easily be a death sentence. Even common ailments like influenza or pneumonia, easily treatable today, were major killers. You thank the healer, perhaps handing over one of your precious, hard-earned coins for a small bag of dried herbs that smell faintly of compost, or a rather ominous-looking amulet. You leave feeling no better and possibly a good deal more anxious. The Roman medical world is a bewildering landscape of ancient wisdom, folk remedies, outright quackery, and genuine, if risky, surgical skill. For you, the poor, unfortunate time traveler, navigating this system while genuinely unwell is a terrifying prospect. You can only hope your 21st century immune system, or sheer dumb luck, sees you through. Because relying on Roman medicine feels like a gamble where the house and the graveyard usually wins. Somehow, you've managed to survive your brush with Roman healthcare, emerging from the experience perhaps a little wiser, definitely more cynical, and with a profound appreciation for the simple miracle of not actively dying. But Rome, with its relentless noise, its crushing crowds, its ever-present dangers, and its soul-destroying labor, is starting to wear you down. The thought of escaping the city, even for a little while, begins to fester in your mind like a particularly persistent blister. Maybe there's work elsewhere, a quieter life, or maybe you just need to see something beyond these grimy city walls before you completely lose your sanity. So, with little more than the threadbare tunic on your back and a desperate hope for, well, something else, you decide to hit the road. You find yourself on one of the great Roman roads, perhaps even the legendary Via Appia, the Queen of Roads, stretching south from Rome. And at first glance, it's impressive. These roads are an engineering marvel, built straight as an arrow, paved with large, durable stones, and designed to last for centuries, primarily for the swift movement of legions, but civilians use them too. You see the regularly placed milestones, telling you the distance from Rome, each one a small stone testament to the empire's reach and organization. They are also, you'll soon discover, excellent for calculating exactly how much longer you're going to suffer on your ill-advised journey. But the grandeur of the road quickly fades once you start your actual journey, especially if you're traveling like most poor Romans would, on foot. Forget comfortable, air-conditioned cars or high-speed trains. Your mode of transport is your own two legs, shod in those same ill-fitting sandals that are already giving you grief. The pace is brutally slow. A good day's walk might cover 20, maybe 30 miles if you're fit and unencumbered, which you are not. You're probably carrying a small, pathetic bundle with your meager possessions, and your fitness level has been defined more by avoiding being trampled than by any kind of athletic training. The phrase, "Are we there yet?" was almost certainly coined by some unfortunate Roman child on a family road trip, probably about 2 hours after leaving the city gates. You're not alone on the road, of course. You'll encounter a motley assortment of fellow travelers. Peddlers with laden mules, farmers taking their produce to market, dusty legionaries marching with grim efficiency, perhaps even a wealthy noble being carried in a lectica, a covered litter borne by 8 sweating slaves, looking down with supreme indifference at the common folk trudging through the dust. Heavily laden wagons, their solid wooden wheels groaning and creaking, also use the roads, but they are even slower than you, and their passage churns up yet more dust to choke on. One of an ancient traveler's greatest fears was banditry. While the roads closer to major cities like Rome were generally safer, more remote stretches could be genuinely perilous. Bands of brigands, often runaway slaves, army deserters, or desperate peasants, would prey on unwary travelers. There's no Roman highway patrol to call, no roadside assistance program, unless you count a friendly bandit offering to assist you by lightening your load of any valuables. You find yourself constantly scanning the horizon, eyeing every shadowy grove or rocky outcrop with suspicion. You might recall stories of major slave revolts, like the famous uprising led by Spartacus in 73 BC. He and his army of rebellious slaves moved with astonishing speed along these very Roman roads, terrorizing the countryside and defeating Roman legions. While that was centuries ago, the roads themselves are a reminder that peace and order, even here, can be fragile. As dusk approaches, you face another challenge: finding shelter for the night. You can't just pitch a tent by the roadside. That's asking for trouble. Your best bet is to reach a capona or a mancio, a Roman inn. And let me tell you, these are not charming bed and breakfast establishments. Roman inns had a generally terrible reputation. They were often dirty, flea-ridden, overcrowded, and frequented by a clientele that could include prostitutes, gamblers, and other less than savory characters. The food would be basic and probably overpriced, the wine watered down and sour. The beds, if you could even call them that, might be simple wooden bunks or just a pile of straw in a communal room. shared with a chorus of snorers and whatever vermin called the place home. One travel writer of the time quipped that the beds in some inns had fewer legs than some of the previous occupants, which paints a rather vivid, if unsettling, picture. You'd be lucky to get out with your possessions and your dignity intact. And how do you even know where you're going? You don't have a GPS, no handy app on a smartphone. Roman maps existed, but they weren't what you'd expect. The most famous example, the Tabula Peutingeriana, isn't a geographically accurate map but more of a schematic diagram, a hugely elongated scroll showing roads as straight lines, with towns, rest stops, mutations where you could change horses, and mansions for overnight stays, and distances marked along them. It's more like a modern subway map, designed to show connections and distances rather than true geographical layout. Not that you have access to such a rare and expensive item. You're relying on milestones, directions from other travelers, who may or may not be reliable, and a whole lot of hope. Historians still debate the extent to which Roman roads truly facilitated social and economic integration for the average provincial, versus primarily serving military and administrative purposes. From your perspective as a footsore traveler, they certainly connect places, but they also emphasize the vastness of the distances and the sheer effort required to traverse them. Every mile is earned through sweat and aching muscles. The psychological toll of such a journey is also significant. There's the monotony of walking, the constant low-level fear, the discomfort, the exposure to the elements, scorching sun, biting wind, sudden downpours. There's a profound sense of isolation, even if there are other travelers around. The world feels immense, almost overwhelmingly so, when you're experiencing it at 3 miles per hour. Your little bubble of Rome, which seems so all-encompassing, now feels like a distant memory, and the world beyond it is vast, indifferent, and full of unknown challenges. Attempting to travel in the Roman world, especially on a shoestring budget, is not a scenic holiday. It's an arduous, perilous, and incredibly slow undertaking. You quickly realize that those impressive Roman roads, while a testament to engineering skill, don't make the journey itself easy. They just make it possible in the most basic sense of the word. As you limp into another disreputable inn at the end of another long day, smelling faintly of despair and road dust, you might wonder if escaping Rome was such a brilliant idea after all. At least in the city, the misery was familiar. Out here, it's a whole new landscape of potential suffering. Whether you're trudging along a dusty Roman road, battling for survival in the cutthroat job market of the city, or just trying to make it through another day in your leaky insula without contracting some new and exciting disease, one thing becomes abundantly clear. Life in ancient Rome is precarious. And when life feels precarious, humans have a tendency to look for answers, or at least some form of reassurance, from a higher power. Or, in the case of Rome, a bewilderingly large committee of higher powers. Forget your simple monotheism, or even a neatly organized pantheon. Roman religion is a sprawling, complex, and often contradictory tapestry of gods, goddesses, spirits, rituals, and superstitions, and you, my bewildered time traveler, need to get up to speed, fast, if you don't want to inadvertently call down some divine wrath upon your already overburdened head. Your main prayer quickly becomes, "Dear assorted deities, please don't let me accidentally anger a god I haven't even heard of yet today." First off, there are the big names, the Olympians you might vaguely remember from school. Jupiter, king of the gods, wielder of thunderbolts, and generally not someone you want to annoy. His formidable wife Juno, goddess of marriage and childbirth, who probably has a very long list of Jupiter's transgressions. Mars, the god of war, always popular in a militaristic society. Venus, goddess of love and beauty, who presumably has her work cut out for her amidst the general grime. Minerva, goddess of wisdom and crafts, and Neptune, moody ruler of the seas. That's just the A-list. There are dozens more, each with their own spheres of influence, their own temples, their own festivals, and their own particular sensitivities. You'd need a divine spreadsheet to keep track of who's responsible for what and what kind of offering they prefer on a Tuesday. But it doesn't stop there. Oh no, the Romans were great spiritual hoarders. They had household gods, the Laras and Penates, little figurines probably kept in a small shrine, a lararium in every home. Even your crummy insular room might have a niche for them, who watched over the family and the larder. There were spirits of place, the genius loci, inhabiting every grove, spring, or crossroads. Traveling, better say a quick prayer to Mercury, god of travelers and thieves. An interesting combo. Farming, Ceres is your go-to goddess. Then there were the countless minor deities and personifications of virtues like Fortuna, luck, spes, hope, and Concordia, harmony. And just to keep things interesting, the Romans were remarkably open to adopting gods from other cultures they conquered or traded with. So, you'll find temples to the Egyptian goddess Isis, the Persian god Mithras, particularly popular with soldiers, and a host of others, all jostling for attention and worship. It's a veritable spiritual smorgasbord, and a deeply confusing one for a newcomer. The core of Roman religion, especially the state cult, was about maintaining the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods. This was a kind of contractual relationship. If Rome honored the gods correctly, with the proper rituals and sacrifices, then the gods, in turn, would favor Rome with prosperity, victory, and stability. It was less about deep personal faith or moral guidance, though those existed in other philosophical and religious contexts, and more about meticulous observance of tradition. Priests, known as pontiffs, augurs, and others, weren't necessarily spiritual leaders in the modern sense, but more like highly skilled technicians of the sacred, ensuring every ritual was performed with absolute precision. A misspoken word, a flawed sacrifice, and the whole thing could be invalid, potentially angering the gods. No pressure. You'd see religion everywhere. Small shrines at street corners, grand temples in the forum, people muttering prayers or making small offerings of food or wine. Animal sacrifice was a central part of major rituals. You might witness a solemn procession leading a garlanded bull or sheep to an altar, where it would be ritually dispatched, its entrails then examined by a haruspex for omens. Good liver? Excellent, Jupiter is pleased. Spotted liver? Oh, better try again or prepare for trouble. This wasn't a PETA-friendly environment, to put it mildly. Omens and divination were a massive part of Roman life. Everything could be a sign. The flight of birds, interpreted by augurs, thunder and lightning, unusual animal behavior, dreams, all were scrutinized for messages from the divine. An odd factoid for you: Romans kept sacred chickens, the puli sacri. Before important undertakings like a battle, the chickens would be offered grain. If they ate it greedily, it was a good omen. If they refused, it was a bad sign. There's a famous, and probably apocryphal story about a Roman consul, Publius Claudius Pulcher, before a naval battle. When the sacred chickens refused to eat, he, in a fit of pique, reportedly threw them overboard, declaring, "If they will not eat, let them drink." He then proceeded to lose the battle catastrophically. The gods, it seems, do not appreciate sarcasm, especially when it involves their feathered prognosticators. A bad omen, like a bird flying the wrong way across your path, could genuinely derail your plans for the day faster than any modern weather forecast predicting a downpour. As a newcomer, you'd feel an immense pressure to at least appear observant, even if you haven't the faintest idea what you're doing. You might try to copy the gestures of others, mutter something vaguely pious, and avoid doing anything that looks obviously disrespectful near a temple or shrine. Blasphemy, or even perceived impiety, could have serious social, if not legal, consequences. And then there's the imperial cult. From Augustus onwards, emperors and sometimes their family members were often deified after their death, and sometimes even honored as divine or semi-divine while still alive. Participating in the rituals honoring the emperor and the genius of Rome became a way of demonstrating loyalty to the state. Refusing to do so, as groups like the early Christians later discovered, could be seen as treason. This added another layer of religious obligation to your already crowded spiritual to-do list. While Rome was generally quite tolerant of different religions, allowing conquered peoples to continue worshiping their own gods, often by identifying them with Roman equivalents, there were limits. Cults that were seen as secretive, overly emotional, or potentially subversive to public order or Roman morality could be suppressed. The Senate's crackdown on the Bacchanalia, the rites of the god Bacchus, in 186 BC is a famous example, driven by fears of conspiracy and moral decay. So, while you have many divine options, choosing the wrong one, or practicing your chosen one too enthusiastically, could also land you in hot water. Historians still debate the extent to which the average Roman genuinely believed in the efficacy of state-sponsored rituals versus seeing them primarily as civic duties or traditional formalities. Did that shopkeeper offering a pinch of incense to Mercury truly believe it would bring him good business? Or was he just going through motions that his father and grandfather had performed? It's hard to say. For many, it was likely a complex mix of genuine belief, ingrained habit, social expectation, and a healthy dose of better safe than sorry. For you, it all adds up to a constant low-level anxiety. Did you use the right greeting for that particular shrine? Was that offering acceptable? Is the fact that a black cat just crossed your path a sign that you've mortally offended some obscure deity of pathways or felines? You're trying to juggle the demands of Jupiter, Mars, your household Lauras, the spirit of the leaky drain in your insula, and the divine genius of the current emperor, all while trying not to starve or get run over by a chariot. It's exhausting. It makes you long for the days when your biggest spiritual concern was whether you'd remembered to recycle properly. In Rome, every day is a test of your ability to appease a seemingly infinite number of invisible and potentially irritable landlords of the cosmos. After navigating the labyrinthine rules of Roman religion, constantly terrified you're about to offend some obscure deity of doorknobs or dust bunnies, you'd think the mortal world would offer some clarity. Wrong. If anything, the flow of information, or rather, the lack thereof in ancient Rome is just as confusing and anxiety-inducing as trying to keep track of Jupiter's love life. In an age without instant messaging, 24-hour news channels, or even a reliably printed newspaper, you are adrift in a sea of whispers, rumors, and official pronouncements that may or may not reach you in time, if at all. Forget checking Twitter for updates. The closest you'll get is an actual bird flying by, which, as we've established, is probably just another omen you'll misinterpret. So, how do you find out what's going on? Mostly through word of mouth. The local tavern, the public baths, if you can afford the entrance fee and brave the general atmosphere of damp humanity. The bustling marketplace, the steps of the forum, these are your news hubs. Here, people gather, gossip, and exchange tidbits of information, ranging from the price of grain to the latest imperial scandal, or who got dramatically stabbed in that dodgy alley last night. The problem is, this information is about as reliable as a chariot with one wheel. Stories get embellished with each retelling, facts become distorted, and outright fabrications spread like wildfire. The original fake news didn't need social media bots. It just needed a few enthusiastic Romans with active imaginations and too much time on their hands. The most reliable source of news often seemed to be that guy in the tavern who knows a guy who heard from his cousin's best friend's former legionary buddy. You get the picture. Official news? Well, there was the Acta Diurna, a sort of daily gazette handwritten on wooden boards and posted in public places like the Forum. It contained official announcements, decrees, notable births and deaths, and perhaps some sanitized military news. But firstly, you'd have to be literate to read it. Secondly, you'd have to physically go to where it was posted, braving the crowds. And thirdly, it only contained what the state wanted you to know. Not exactly investigative journalism. Heralds might also proclaim important edicts in public squares. But if you weren't there at the right time, or if the crowd was too noisy, you'd miss it. The concept of breaking news in Rome probably meant a stone tablet containing the Acta Diurna literally broke. Imagine a major event occurs, say a distant earthquake, a significant military defeat on a far-flung frontier, or, heaven forbid, a catastrophic event like the eruption of Mount Vesuvius that buried Pompeii and Herculaneum in 79 AD. News of such a disaster would trickle back to Rome incredibly slowly. First, vague rumors might arrive with travelers or merchants, tales of devastation and horror, likely exaggerated or minimized depending on the teller. Could take days, even weeks, for more concrete official reports to reach the capital. In the meantime, fear and uncertainty would ripple through the populace, especially for anyone with family or business in the affected region. You'd be desperate for information, for any scrap of news, but all you'd get are conflicting stories and a gnawing sense of dread. This slow, unreliable information flow leaves you incredibly vulnerable. A new law might be passed that directly affects you, but you might not find out about it until you've inadvertently broken it. A plague could be sweeping through a neighboring district, but by the time you hear the warnings, it might already be on your doorstep. Rumors of food shortages could cause panic buying and price hikes, leaving you unable to afford your daily bread. Or a charismatic charlatan could whip up a crowd with entirely false promises or accusations, and you, lacking any way to verify his claims, might get caught up in the ensuing chaos. You might see evidence of another, more informal news channel scrawled on the city's walls: graffiti. While not exactly the New York Times, Roman graffiti, found extensively in places like Pompeii, reveals a vibrant undercurrent of public expression. You'd see everything from crude caricatures of politicians and declarations of love, to advertisements for gladiatorial games or brothels, and even simple messages like, "Gaius was here." It's a raw, uncensored form of communication, a public notice board for the masses, reflecting their everyday concerns, frustrations, and amusements. It's probably more entertaining than the Acta Diurna, though its accuracy is equally suspect. Historians still debate the speed and efficiency of the cursus publicus, the state-run courier and transportation service, and how much news from the provinces actually reached the common person in Rome, as opposed to just official dispatches for the elite. The cursus publicus was an impressive logistical network of roads, relay stations, and messengers designed to carry official communications across the vast empire. But it was primarily for government and military use. Important news might eventually filter down from the elite circles that received these dispatches, but it would be a slow and often distorted trickle. You certainly wouldn't be getting a direct memo from the emperor about his latest strategic decisions. The frustration of this information vacuum is immense. You're constantly trying to piece together a coherent picture of the world from fragmented, unreliable sources. It's like trying to assemble a jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces are missing and the other half belong to a different puzzle entirely. This makes planning, or even just feeling secure, incredibly difficult. If you wanted to spread a rumor effectively in ancient Rome, you probably just had to whisper it to a couple of talkative individuals at the public baths, and it would be all over the city by dinner time, likely in a hilariously garbled form. This constant state of not quite knowing is a significant source of stress. Your modern mind, accustomed to having the sum of human knowledge and a lot of nonsense available at your fingertips, would struggle profoundly. You're used to verifying sources, cross-referencing information, getting instant updates. Here, you have to rely on your gut, your ability to read people who are often trying to deceive you, and a healthy dose of skepticism that borders on paranoia. Every piece of news has to be weighed. Who told me this? What's their agenda? Does it sound plausible or just like something Publius made up after too much cheap wine? Living in this information fog means you're not just navigating a physical city, but a landscape of whispers, half-truths, and deliberate misinformation. It leaves you feeling isolated, even in the midst of a crowded city, and acutely aware of how little control you have, not just over your own life, but over your very understanding of the world around you. It's a stark reminder that knowledge, even flawed knowledge, is power, and in ancient Rome, you have precious little of it. So you're perpetually misinformed, possibly offending a new deity every time you sneeze, and generally feeling like a square peg in a round, ancient hole. Just when you think you've hit peak discomfort, you become acutely aware of another daily trial, your clothes. Or rather, the rough, unfamiliar garments that have replaced your comfortable 21st century attire. Forget your favorite worn-in jeans, your soft cotton t-shirts, your technologically advanced weatherproof jacket. Those are distant, almost mythical memories now. You are a Roman fashion victim, and the main victim is your skin. Your primary garment, the one you live, work, and probably sleep in, is the tunica. Sounds simple enough, right? It's essentially a couple of pieces of cloth sewn together, usually wool, sometimes linen if you're a bit luckier or it's high summer. It might be sleeveless or have short sleeves, and it probably comes down to your knees or a bit longer. Think of it as a very, very basic, oversized t-shirt made from material that feels suspiciously like industrial-grade scouring pads. That soft, breathable cotton you're used to, a rare luxury, mostly imported from distant lands like India. Here, wool is king, and Roman wool, especially the cheap stuff you're likely wearing, isn't exactly merino. It's coarse, it's oily, and it's incredibly itchy, particularly when combined with the sweat and grime of a typical Roman day. You spend a lot of time subtly scratching, trying to relieve the constant prickle without looking like you've contracted some kind of galloping Roman mange. Your new tunic probably doesn't fit well either. It's either too big and shapeless, making you look like you lost a fight with a potato sack, or too small and restrictive. And practicality? Not so much. One of the first things you'll notice is the glaring absence of pockets. Where do you put your few precious coins? Your chunk of bread? That interesting and possibly cursed amulet you bought? You can tuck things into a belt if you have one, or carry a small pouch, but it's a constant source of low-level anxiety, worrying about things falling out or being snatched. Your modern life, with its abundance of secure zippered compartments, suddenly seems like a marvel of convenience. As you look around, you realize that clothing in Rome is far more than just a way to cover your nudity. It's a walking billboard advertising your status, your citizenship, your gender, and even your profession. You see Roman citizens, male citizens, that is, swathed in the famous toga. This isn't just any old bit of cloth. It's a massive, semicircular swathe of heavy white wool, draped around the body in a complex and specific way. It looks impressive, regal even, but it's also incredibly cumbersome. It restricts movement, it's hot, and it's a nightmare to keep clean. The main skill in wearing a toga seemed to be not tripping over its voluminous folds and accidentally showing everyone your subligaculum, the basic loincloth worn underneath. It's definitely not work attire. It's a garment for public appearances, for demonstrating your Romanness and your standing in society. It's an odd factoid that togas were notoriously difficult to put on correctly, often requiring the assistance of a slave, and their sheer weight made them a burden. Even some ancient Romans apparently grumbled about having to wear them. You, thankfully, are probably not burdened with a toga. It's for citizens, and you're still in the bewildered newcomer category. Your simple, probably drab-colored tunic marks you out as lower class, a worker, or just generally unimportant. Married Roman women of respectable status wear a stola, a long, often pleated outer tunic worn over an inner one, sometimes girdled beneath the bust and at the hips. Outdoors, they drape themselves in a palla, a large rectangular shawl that could also be pulled up to cover the head. Historians still debate the extent to which Roman women, particularly of the lower classes, were consistently veiled or covered their heads in public, as depictions in art vary and literary sources can be ambiguous. But for upper-class women, modesty and dignity were paramount, and their clothing reflected that. Your footwear is likely to be equally basic. Simple leather sandals, or solii, are common, especially indoors or in warmer weather. For more robust outdoor wear, or if you were, say, a soldier, you might have caligy, heavy-duty hobnailed sandals or boots. Either way, walking on those uneven, often filthy Roman streets in what amounts to a few leather straps and a sole is an acquired taste. Blisters become your constant companions. And keeping these clothes clean, that's a whole other adventure. There's no washing machine, no convenient dry cleaner around the corner. Fullers, the Roman launderers, had a challenging job, especially with those prized white togas. And one of their key cleaning agents, as we've touched upon before, was stale urine, valued for its ammonia content, which helped to bleach and cleanse the wool. So, that gleaming white toga of a passing senator? It might have had a rather organic journey to achieve that pristine look. Your own tunic probably just gets dirtier and smellier, washed infrequently in cold water if you're lucky, and then dried stiff in the sun. The concept of freshly laundered is, for you, a distant dream. The Roman state even took an interest in what people wore. Various sumptuary laws were enacted over the centuries, attempting to curb extravagance in dress and reinforce social hierarchies. Certain colors, like Tyrian purple, an incredibly expensive dye extracted from sea snails, were often restricted to the emperor or high-ranking senators. Wearing the wrong thing wasn't just a fashion faux pas. It could be a statement of rebellion or presumption, and could get you into trouble. Roman fashion's primary goals often seemed to be twofold: to make sure everyone knew their place, and also to be vaguely flammable, given the materials and proximity to open flames. So you shuffle along in your itchy, ill-fitting tunic and your basic sandals, feeling exposed, uncomfortable, and distinctly out of place. Your clothes don't just fail to protect you adequately from the elements. They actively contribute to your discomfort and mark you out in the complex social landscape of Rome. It's a constant, chafing reminder of your alien status, another layer of hardship in a world that already seems determined to test your endurance at every turn. You long for the simple comfort of your old clothes, for the freedom of movement and the anonymity they provided. Here, even what you wear is a source of struggle and a statement you don't get to control. You're itchy, uncomfortable in your Roman-issue potato sack tunic, and generally feeling like a displaced person in a very scratchy historical reenactment. You've dealt with sensory overload, questionable food, dangerous streets, and the constant, nagging fear of offending one of Rome's myriad deities. Just when you think you've got a handle on the daily discomforts, Rome decides to throw another delightful curveball your way: political instability. Because what's a sprawling ancient empire without a bit of heart-stopping, life-threatening political drama to keep things interesting for the common folk? Forget peaceful transfers of power and polite parliamentary debates. Roman politics, especially when it comes to who gets to wear the imperial purple, can turn deadly with terrifying speed. You might first sense it as a change in the city's atmosphere. The usual background hum of commerce and chatter might be punctuated by more anxious whispers. Perhaps there are more soldiers on the streets than usual, their expressions grim. Or maybe the price of bread in the market has suddenly spiked, and angry muttering can be heard among the crowds queuing for their meager rations. In Rome, the line between a disgruntled populace and a full-blown riot could be perilously thin. Political commentary wasn't just a hobby for retired legionaries. It was a risky business that could get you noticed in all the wrong ways. The Roman Empire, for all its power and glory, had a rather messy system when it came to imperial succession. There wasn't always a clear, undisputed heir. Emperors could be assassinated, overthrown by ambitious generals, or even bought and sold by a fickle Praetorian guard. The emperor's supposed bodyguards who sometimes acted more like kingmakers or emperor breakers. When the Praetorian Guard got involved, it wasn't usually to protect and serve the status quo, but to select and swerve the entire course of the empire. The main qualification for becoming emperor sometimes seemed to be a willingness to eliminate the previous incumbent and a very persuasive speech or a very large bribe for the troops. One day, you find yourself swept up in it. Perhaps it starts as a protest in the forum. A crowd gathers, initially just a few disgruntled citizens, then growing larger, fueled by rumors of a new tax, or anger at an unpopular magistrate, or perhaps celebrating the downfall of a hated imperial advisor. The shouting starts, slogans are chanted, then someone throws a stone, and suddenly, the mood shifts from angry demonstration to outright riot. The air fills with a terrifying roar, the sound of thousands of frustrated voices unleashed. You see shopkeepers frantically shuttering their stalls. People are running, some towards the chaos, many more, like you, desperately trying to get away. This isn't a modern, organized protest with designated marshals and police liaisons. This is raw, unpredictable mob energy. Voting with your feet in a Roman riot primarily means running away very, very fast before you get trampled or mistaken for a looter. If you're unlucky, you get caught in the middle. The press of bodies is immense, a terrifying, uncontrolled force. You can't see, you can barely breathe. Panic sets in. Then the sound of marching feet, the clang of armor. The urban cohorts have arrived, or worse, the Praetorians, to restore order. And their methods are not gentle. Swords are drawn, shields are locked, and the order they restore often involves a lot of cracked heads and terrified citizens scrambling for safety. You might witness brutality that makes the gladiatorial games look like a choreographed ballet. Your only thought is survival, to escape the crushing tide of humanity and the indiscriminate violence of the authorities. This kind of volatility wasn't a rare occurrence. Think about the infamous year of the 4 emperors in 69 AD, following Nero's death. Rome was plunged into a series of bloody civil wars as multiple generals vied for the throne. The city itself became a battleground. Imagine living through that, with armies marching through the streets, allegiances shifting daily, and the ever-present threat of violence and proscription, where lists of enemies of the state were posted, and those named could be hunted down and killed, their property confiscated. It's a stark reminder that the Pax Romana, the famed Roman peace, could be a very fragile thing, especially at the heart of the empire. Sometimes, the political upheaval is less overtly violent but just as unsettling. An emperor dies, naturally or otherwise, and a new one takes his place. Suddenly, everything changes. Old favorites are out, new ones are in. Statues of the previous ruler might be torn down, his name chiseled off public inscriptions. This practice, known as damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, was a very public and symbolic way of erasing a disgraced predecessor from history. You might walk through the forum one day and see workers atop ladders, hammers and chisels in hand, diligently removing the name of the recently deceased, and now officially loathed emperor from a triumphal arch. It's a chillingly effective visual reminder of how quickly fortunes can change, and how absolute power can be, even in death. Historians still debate the extent to which the urban plebs in Rome were a genuinely independent political force or were primarily manipulated by ambitious elites and demagogues. From your vantage point, cowering in an alleyway while a riot rages, It feels less like an independent political statement and more like a terrifying, uncontrolled storm. Whether the mob has its own agenda or is merely a tool for others, the consequences for an ordinary person like you are the same. Fear, danger, and profound insecurity. A new imperial decree might be issued overnight, changing some fundamental aspect of your daily life. Perhaps a new tax is levied to fund a distant war, or new restrictions are placed on certain trades or religious practices. There's no public consultation, no debate you get to participate in. The decree is posted, the heralds proclaim it, and you just have to adapt or suffer the consequences. Your life, already so precarious, feels like it's balanced on a knife edge, subject to the whims of powerful men playing dangerous games in marble palaces far removed from your reality. This constant undercurrent of political volatility makes long-term planning impossible and trust a rare commodity. Who is really in charge? Will they be in charge tomorrow? Is that friendly neighbor secretly an informer for some powerful faction? The city, which already felt alien and dangerous, now also feels treacherous, a place where a wrong word or an unlucky association could have dire consequences. The insecurity isn't just about crime or poverty anymore. It's about the very stability of the world around you. And you, a tiny, insignificant cog in this vast imperial machine, can only watch and hope and try to stay out of the way when the political earth starts to shake. Just when you think you've cataloged all the ways Rome can make your life miserable, from its chaotic politics to its itchy fashion sense, Mother Nature decides to remind you that she, too, can be a fickle and terrifying landlady in this ancient world. Forget climate control, advanced weather forecasting, or emergency services swooping in to save the day. You are utterly exposed to the raw, untamed elements and the geological grumblings of a planet that hasn't yet been thoroughly mapped, understood, or pacified by human ingenuity. If political unrest makes you feel like a pawn, nature's wrath makes you feel like an ant in a thunderstorm. Let's start with the basics. Fire. We've touched on how your insula is basically a tinderbox waiting for a stray spark. But imagine this on a city-wide scale. With open braziers for heating and cooking, flickering oil lamps for light, and buildings made largely of wood-packed cheek by jowl, a small accidental fire could, and often did, escalate into a raging inferno that consumed entire districts. There's no fire department with pumper trucks and hydraulic ladders. There are the vigiles with their buckets and axes, doing their best, but often overwhelmed by the sheer speed and ferocity of the flames. You'd live with the constant, acrid smell of wood smoke in the air, and a persistent, low-level fear of being roasted in your sleep. Then there's water, specifically the Tiber River. Rome's lifeline, yes, but also a frequent source of watery woe. The Tiber was prone to flooding, especially after heavy rains in the Apennine Mountains. When it burst its banks, the low-lying areas of the city, which, naturally, included many of the poorer districts where you'd be living, would be inundated. Imagine waking up to find murky, refuse-filled water swirling around your ankles, rising rapidly. You'd scramble for higher ground if there was any losing what few possessions you had. The floodwaters would damage buildings, contaminate food supplies, and, once they receded, leave behind a lovely layer of stinking mud and a perfect breeding ground for disease. The Tiber flooding wasn't just an inconvenience. It was the river's way of personally visiting everyone in the cheap seats, whether they wanted it to or not, and leaving a rather unpleasant housewarming gift. Italy is also a seismically active region. Earthquakes were a known, if unpredictable, hazard. Without any warning systems, the first indication of a quake would be the ground suddenly lurching beneath your feet, a terrifying, disorienting sensation. Buildings would groan and sway, walls would crack. If it was a strong one, those shoddily built insulae could pancake in an instant, burying their inhabitants. The ensuing panic, the cries of the injured, the dust filling the air. It would be a scene of utter chaos and devastation. Roman disaster preparedness for such events consisted mostly of praying fervently to whichever god seemed least annoyed that day and hoping for the best. And of course, we can't talk about geological hazards in Roman Italy without mentioning volcanoes. While you might not be living directly at the foot of Mount Vesuvius, its catastrophic eruption in 79 AD, which famously obliterated Pompeii and Herculaneum, would have sent shockwaves of terror throughout the region. Imagine hearing the news, days or weeks later, brought by ash-covered, traumatized survivors, tales of a mountain exploding, of skies turning black, of hot ash and pumice raining down, of entire towns vanishing. Pliny the Younger's vivid eyewitness account of the eruption and the death of his uncle, Pliny the Elder, who sailed towards the disaster in a brave but fatal attempt to observe it and rescue survivors, gives us a chilling glimpse into the horror. Even if you weren't directly affected, the knowledge that the very earth beneath your feet could unleash such fury would add another heavy layer to your already substantial burden of anxieties. Then there are the smaller, more insidious natural threats, the pests and the diseases they carry. Malaria, often called Roman fever, was endemic in many parts of Italy, particularly near marshy areas like the Pontine Marshes not far from Rome. Transmitted by mosquitoes, it caused recurring fevers, chills, and weakness, and could be fatal, especially for the already malnourished or otherwise vulnerable. You'd slap at whining mosquitoes constantly, especially in the humid summer months, with no effective repellent beyond hoping the smoke from your cooking fire kept them vaguely at bay. The mosquitoes in Rome were probably so big and persistent, they could have formed their own legion and demanded a triumph. An interesting, if not always effective, factoid is that Romans were aware of the connection between swamps and disease, and sometimes attempted forms of pest control, like draining marshy land or introducing fish to eat mosquito larvae. They even had a festival, the Robigalia, on April 25th, dedicated to the god Robigus to protect grain crops from rust disease, a type of fungus, showing their acute awareness of agricultural blights. Historians still debate the long-term ecological impact of Roman activities, such as deforestation and mining on the Mediterranean landscape, and whether these contributed to localized climate changes or soil erosion. While you wouldn't be thinking in terms of climate change, you might notice the effects. Hillsides stripped bare of trees for timber and fuel, rivers silting up, or localized droughts impacting food supplies. The environment wasn't an abstract concept. It was an active participant in your daily struggle. And when disaster struck, a major flood, an earthquake, a devastating fire, there was no FEMA to call, no organized national disaster relief agency in the modern sense. The emperor might provide some aid, distribute food, or fund rebuilding efforts, especially if the disaster was politically sensitive. But for the average person, recovery would be slow and arduous, often dependent on personal resilience, community support, if any, or simply finding the means to move elsewhere and start again. You are, in essence, living without a safety net in a world where nature's power is frequently and dramatically on display. There are no weather apps to warn you of an impending storm, no seismographs to give you a few precious seconds warning before an earthquake, no public health campaigns to educate you about disease prevention. You rely on folk wisdom, omens, and a large dose of luck. This constant exposure to environmental hazards, on top of all the man-made ones, would create a profound sense of vulnerability, a feeling that you are a tiny, fragile being in a world of immense and often hostile forces. Surviving Rome isn't just about navigating its society. It's about surviving the planet itself in one of its more temperamental moods. So, you've dodged collapsing buildings, sidestepped political riots, and miraculously avoided being consumed by Vesuvius's little brother or a particularly aggressive strain of Roman swamp fever. You might think you're getting the hang of this survival game, but just when you start to feel a tiny, misguided spark of confidence, Rome hits you with another set of invisible, yet incredibly powerful constraints, gender roles and societal expectations. Forget forging your own path or smashing any ancient glass ceilings. In this world, your perceived gender dictates a huge part of your life, from your daily chores to your ultimate destiny, and stepping out of line is generally not advised. Let's assume for a moment that the Romans perceive you as male. Congratulations, you've nominally landed on the more privileged side of the gender divide. You have the potential to become a paterfamilias, the all-powerful head of a Roman household, wielding legal authority, patria potestas, over your wife, your children, even if they're grown adults with families of their own, your slaves, and all your property. This is the Roman ideal, a man of gravitas, dignified seriousness, pietas, dutiful respect for gods, state, and family, and virtus, manly courage and excellence. You're expected to be the provider, the protector, the public face of your family. Your domain is the world of business, politics, if you're of the right class, and warfare. A Roman man's idea of sharing household chores was probably telling a slave which part of the mosaic floor needed extra scrubbing. But here's the catch. If you're still our bewildered, penniless time traveler, you're a long way from embodying that ideal. You have no family here, no property, no status. Yet the expectations linger. You're still expected to be strong, to endure hardship without complaint. No whining about your itchy tunic, thank you very much. To find work, however menial, and to generally project an air of masculine competence, even if you're internally screaming in confusion. Showing too much emotion, being perceived as weak or effeminate, these are social death knells for a Roman man. Now let's flip the script. If the Romans perceive you as female, your path is even more narrowly defined. Your primary role, the one society relentlessly drills into you from girlhood, is to be a wife and a mother, a materfamilias. Your domain is the domus, the household. You are expected to manage the domestic affairs, supervise the slaves, if the household can afford them, oversee the raising of children, teaching your sons to be good Romans and your daughters to be good future wives, and above all, to be a paragon of chastity, modesty, and loyalty. Spinning wool, lanificium, was the archetypal symbol of wifely virtue, even for aristocratic women. Your career counseling, were such a thing to exist, would be very short. Option 1, get married. Option 2, see Option 1. If you were lucky, you might aim to be a Vestal Virgin, one of the few public roles for women, guardians of Rome's sacred flame. But that came with a 30-year commitment and a rather strict vow of celibacy, the breaking of which had decidedly unpleasant consequences. Legally, as a woman, you'd be under the authority of your father, and then, upon marriage, usually under the authority of your husband or his father, if he was still alive. This was known as being in manu, in the hand, of a male guardian. While Roman women could, and an odd factoid here, often did own property, inherit wealth, and even run businesses, especially by the imperial period, their legal autonomy was curtailed. They couldn't vote, couldn't hold public office, and their public appearances were often expected to be discreet and accompanied. Your dating advice as a Roman girl probably consisted of, look demure, don't offer too many opinions, and make sure your dowry is looking healthy. Marriage itself, for both sexes but especially for women, was rarely about romantic love as you might understand it. It was a social and economic contract designed to forge alliances between families, consolidate property, and, crucially, produce legitimate citizen children. Girls were often married off very young, sometimes in their early teens, to men considerably older. The state even took an interest in your marital status and reproductive habits. Emperor Augustus, for instance, introduced a series of laws, the Julian laws on marriage and the Lex Papia Papia, aimed at encouraging marriage and childbearing among the upper classes, offering rewards for those who complied and imposing penalties on bachelors and the childless. The state literally wanted you to get busy for the good of Rome. Daily life would be a constant navigation of these expectations. If you're female, venturing out alone into certain parts of the city, or at certain times, would be considered highly improper and could invite unwanted attention or damage your reputation. Your clothing, your speech, your very demeanor would be scrutinized for conformity to the ideal of the modest matron or virtuous maiden. If you're male, you'd feel the pressure to associate with other men in public spaces like the forum or the baths, to engage in manly pursuits, and to avoid any hint of idleness or unseemly behavior. Historians still debate the actual lived experiences of Roman women across different social classes, and how much their legal subordination translated into practical powerlessness or, conversely, informal influence within the family and community. While the laws and the ideals painted a picture of strict male dominance, it's likely that many women, through force of personality, intelligence, or the management of household resources, wielded considerable informal power. And lower-class women, out of sheer economic necessity, often worked outside the home in market stalls, taverns, laundries, or as artisans, which inevitably gave them a degree of independence and public presence not afforded to their wealthier, more secluded counterparts. But for you, the time traveler, stripped of your familiar social context, these rigid roles would feel incredibly confining. Your 21st century ideas about gender equality, personal choice, and self-expression would find no purchase here. You are expected to fit into a predefined slot, and the social pressure to conform would be immense. Any deviation could lead to ostracism, ridicule, or even more serious consequences if your behavior was seen as a threat to public order or morality. It's another layer of profound discomfort, this constant awareness that you're being judged not just for your actions, but for how well you perform your assigned gender. Your skills, your intellect, your desires, all are secondary to the role society has carved out for you. It's like being forced to wear not just an itchy tunic, but an itchy, ill-fitting identity, one that chafes at your very sense of self. Surviving in Rome means not just finding food and shelter, but also learning to play your part, or else risk becoming a social outcast in a world that has very little tolerance for those who don't fit in. Trapped by the unyielding expectations of Roman gender roles, you might find yourself yearning for some form of escape, some way to broaden your horizons beyond the narrow confines of your prescribed life. And what's a classic route to self-improvement and understanding the world? Education, of course. Knowledge is power, right? Well, in ancient Rome, knowledge is primarily a luxury, and the path to acquiring it is often a trial by boredom, repetition, and the very real threat of a good caning. So, if you're harboring dreams of enrolling in a Roman community college and picking up a few night classes, you might want to temper your expectations. Your first, and probably insurmountable, hurdle is cost. Unlike your modern world with its public school systems and student loan programs, however flawed they may be, Roman education was overwhelmingly private. Parents paid fees to teachers, and those fees effectively excluded the vast majority of the population. If your family was struggling to afford that daily loaf of slightly gritty bread, sending you off to learn your letters just wasn't going to be a priority. Education was largely the preserve of the elite, a tool to prepare their sons for careers in politics, law, or the military, and their daughters for managing a household and not embarrassing their future husbands with complete illiteracy. Let's say, through some miracle, you get a chance to observe or even briefly participate in the first stage of Roman schooling, the ludus literarius, or elementary school. Forget dedicated, brightly lit school buildings. An odd factoid for you: these early schools were often incredibly informal affairs. The teacher or literator might rent a small, dingy shop front, set up in a noisy public portico, or even just gather his handful of pupils, mostly boys, aged around 7 to 11, in a quiet corner of a courtyard. You'd see these kids sitting on simple stools, clutching their wax tablets, think ancient iPads, but heavier and erasable with the flat end of your stylus, diligently trying to copy out letters and numbers. The curriculum, it was all about the 3 Rs: reading, writing, and arithmetic. Hours would be spent on rote memorization of the alphabet, syllables, and lists of words. Writing involved scratching onto those wax tablets with a metal or bone stylus, a laborious process. Mathematics often involved an abacus, that ancient calculator with beads on wires, and a lot of finger counting. It was painstaking, monotonous work, often conducted amidst the noise and distractions of the surrounding city. And the teaching methods? Let's just say they weren't heavy on positive reinforcement and play-based learning. Discipline was harsh, and corporal punishment was not just accepted, but considered essential. The ferula, a cane or rod, was a standard piece of classroom equipment, and the Roman equivalent of a school bully was probably the teacher with the biggest stick and the shortest temper. No one was getting a gold star for effort. You were more likely to get your knuckles rapped for a poorly formed letter. If a student, always a boy from a well-to-do family, successfully navigated the ludus, he might move on to a grammaticus around the age of 12. Here, the focus shifted to literature, primarily Greek and Latin classics. Students would analyze texts by poets like Homer and Virgil, or orators like Cicero, dissecting grammar, memorizing long passages, and learning about history and mythology through these works. Forget your modern emphasis on STEM subjects. This was a thoroughly humanities-based education designed to produce articulate, cultured Roman citizens. For the truly elite young men destined for public life, the final stage was the rhetor, a teacher of rhetoric, the art of public speaking. This was crucial for anyone aspiring to a career in the law courts or the Senate. Students would learn to compose and deliver persuasive speeches, engage in debates, and master the finer points of eloquence. The famous Roman educator Quintilian, in his monumental work Institutio Oratoria, laid out a comprehensive vision for the education of an ideal orator, advocating for a broad curriculum and even a somewhat more humane approach to teaching, though still within a system that valued discipline and tradition above all. Passing your final exams in rhetoric probably meant you could recite Virgil backwards while being poked with a stylus and simultaneously composing a flattering ode to the current emperor. And what about girls? Wealthy families might educate their daughters at home, often alongside their brothers in the early years. They'd learn to read and write, manage household accounts, and perhaps study some music and literature enough to be considered cultured and to run an efficient household. But their education was not intended to prepare them for a public role. The vast majority of girls, like the vast majority of boys from poorer families, received no formal schooling at all. It's also worth noting that some slaves, particularly those from Greece or other culturally rich regions, could be highly educated, sometimes more so than their masters. They might serve as tutors for the children of the household, as scribes, librarians, or administrators, their learning put to practical use for their owner's benefit. Historians still debate the overall literacy rates in the Roman Empire, with estimates for basic literacy ranging significantly, but it was certainly far from universal and varied greatly by region, social class, and gender. For you, as someone likely starting from scratch and without resources, accessing any level of this formal education system would be next to impossible. You might pick up a few Latin words out of necessity, learn to recognize some basic symbols or numbers if your work required it, but true literacy, the ability to read a philosophical text, a legal document, or even just a letter would likely remain tantalizingly out of reach. This lack of education isn't just a missed opportunity for personal enrichment. It's another chain binding you to the lower rungs of society. Literacy is power. It allows access to information, to legal understanding, to a broader world of ideas. Without it, you are more easily exploited, more reliant on others, more confined to the narrow world of your immediate experience. You might look with a mixture of envy and resentment at the young nobles heading off to their lessons, knowing that a door to a different kind of life is firmly closed to you. The Roman school of hard knocks, the one you're currently enrolled in, teaches very different and much harsher lessons. So, you're uneducated by Roman standards, stuck in a gender role that feels like a badly fitting toga, and generally overwhelmed by the daily grind of just existing in this ancient megacity. You might be tempted to think that as long as you keep your head down within the massive, solid walls of Rome itself, you're relatively safe from the really big, scary stuff happening out in the wider world. That would be a comforting thought. It would also be wrong. Even here, at the heart of the empire, you can't escape the persistent, unsettling whispers from beyond the walls, tales of distant wars, rebellious provinces, and the ever-present, vaguely defined threat of the barbarians. Rome, for all its marble and might, is the center of a vast, sprawling empire with frontiers that stretch for thousands of miles, along the Rhine and Danube rivers in Europe, across the deserts of the East, and up to the misty northern reaches of Britain where Hadrian's Wall stands as a stone sentinel. And these borders, the limes, are not peaceful, static lines on a map. They are dynamic, often dangerous zones of contact, trade, conflict, and cultural collision. Roman border security was a bit more pointy than modern passport control, often involving legions, forts, and a general state of readiness. You'd hear about it in snippets, through those same unreliable channels of news we discussed earlier. A merchant just back from Gaul might speak of increased raids by Germanic tribes. A soldier on leave, his face hardened by campaigns, might mutter in a tavern about a skirmish with Sarmatian horsemen on the Danube. Letters from relatives serving in distant legions, if they ever arrived, would carry news of hardship and danger. These whispers create a constant, low-level hum of anxiety in the city. The good old days for some Romans were probably just periods when the barbarians were conveniently far away and not currently attempting to pillage a frontier settlement. Who are these barbarians? From the Roman perspective, it's a catch-all term for the myriad of peoples living outside the empire's direct control: Germans, Goths, Celts, Dacians, Parthians, and countless others. They are the other, often depicted in Roman propaganda as savage, uncivilized, and a perpetual threat to Roman order and superiority. The Roman definition of diplomacy with these groups often involved a very sharp gladius and the persuasive argument of a legion or two. Yet, the relationship was complex. These groups were also trading partners, sources of slaves and raw materials, and, in an interesting twist, often served within the Roman military itself. It's an odd factoid that vast numbers of barbarians were recruited as auxiliary troops. After a term of service, typically 25 years, these auxiliaries and their families were granted Roman citizenship, one of the most prized possessions in the ancient world. So, the very people sometimes demonized as the enemy were also an integral part of the imperial defense system, and their distinctive clothing, weaponry, or fighting styles sometimes even influenced Roman military practices. You might see a cohort of these auxiliaries marching through Rome, their appearance strikingly different from the Italian legionaries, a living testament to the empire's multicultural and sometimes contradictory nature. The fear of external threats was deeply ingrained in the Roman psyche, a legacy of historical traumas. The infamous Battle of Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD, where 3 entire Roman legions under Varus were ambushed and annihilated by an alliance of Germanic tribes led by Arminius, a Roman-educated German, no less, sent shockwaves through the empire. It was a devastating blow to Roman prestige and effectively halted Roman expansion into Germania. Centuries later, emperors like Marcus Aurelius would spend years on the northern frontiers fighting grueling campaigns, the Marcomannic Wars, against barbarian incursions. News from the frontier often felt like a bad weather report, cloudy with a chance of invading hordes and possible legionary annihilation. And it wasn't just external threats. The empire, for all its apparent solidity, was also prone to internal convulsions. Provincial rebellions could flare up, like the famous revolt led by Boudica in Britain or the fiercely fought Jewish wars in Judea. These were often brutally suppressed, but they served as a reminder that Roman rule wasn't always accepted peacefully. Even the threat of slave revolts, though less common and on a smaller scale than the legendary uprising of Spartacus, would have lingered in the background, especially in areas with large slave populations. Historians still debate the primary motivations behind Roman expansion. Was it defensive imperialism, a desire for economic gain, slaves, resources, or a pursuit of glory and political prestige for its leaders? Whatever the reasons, the result was an empire that was perpetually at war or preparing for war somewhere along its vast periphery. This constant state of conflict had a tangible impact on life in Rome. Taxes were levied to pay for the legions. Young men were conscripted. Wounded veterans, some missing limbs, others haunted by what they'd seen, would be a common sight on the city streets, a living reminder of the cost of empire. For you, as an ordinary inhabitant, this all contributes to a pervasive sense of unease. You might not fully understand the complex geopolitics of the Rhine frontier or the intricacies of Parthian diplomacy, but you feel the reverberations. The sight of soldiers marching off to some distant, unknown conflict, the worried faces of their families, the hushed conversations about battles won or lost, it all underscores the fragility of peace. You realize that the relative safety within Rome's walls is maintained by the constant vigilance and sacrifice of those on the frontiers. And there's always that nagging fear. What if the walls aren't enough? What if the chaos and violence of the outside world eventually spill over into the heart of the empire? This undercurrent of external and internal threat is yet another layer of insecurity in your Roman life. It's a reminder that your personal struggles for food, shelter, and basic dignity are playing out on a much larger, more dangerous stage. The whispers from beyond the walls are a constant, unsettling soundtrack to your existence, a reminder that Rome's grandeur is built upon a foundation that is perpetually being tested. Listening to all those unsettling whispers about barbarian raids on distant frontiers and simmering rebellions in far-flung provinces, you might start to romanticize the idea of getting out of Rome itself. Maybe life is simpler, quieter, less intensely Roman, out in the countryside or in one of those provincial towns you hear sailors and merchants muttering about. Perhaps the grass is greener, or at least less likely to be trampled by a legion or a rioting mob beyond the city's oppressive walls. It's a nice thought. Hold on to it for a moment, because reality, as usual in your ancient Roman adventure, is about to serve you a heaping platter of disappointment. If you think Rome is tough, wait until you get a taste of life in the wider empire. Should you actually manage to venture beyond the immediate orbit of the capital, perhaps joining a merchant caravan for safety or simply trudging along those endless roads we discussed, you'd quickly discover that the Roman Empire isn't a monolithic entity. It's a vast, sprawling patchwork of diverse cultures, landscapes, and climates, all held together by the sinews of Roman military power, law, and administration. From the misty forests of Gaul and Britannia to the sun-baked deserts of Syria and Egypt, from the sophisticated cities of Greece to the rugged mountains of Hispania, life could vary dramatically. Rome, the city, was the metropole, the glittering, crowded, chaotic heart. Everywhere else, to some degree, was the provinces, and that came with its own unique set of challenges, often more severe than what you faced in the capital. Your first shock in a provincial town, say somewhere in Gaul or perhaps a dusty settlement in North Africa, would be the sheer difference. The language spoken on the streets might be a heavily accented Latin, or more likely, a local tongue you don't understand at all. Asking for directions might get you a blank stare and possibly an offer to buy a slightly suspicious-looking goat. Customs, clothing, food, everything might feel alien, even more so than Rome did initially. While some areas, especially those with a long history of Roman presence or colonization, might boast mini-forums, bathhouses, and amphitheaters, many more would have a much thinner veneer of Romanization. The local Roman influence might just be a badly paved road leading to the governor's residence and a tax collector with an impressively sour disposition. Roman governance in the provinces was a mixed bag. A provincial governor, often a senator or equestrian appointed for a short term, wielded immense power. Some were competent administrators, genuinely trying to maintain peace and justice. Others were corrupt opportunists, seeing their provincial posting as a chance to enrich themselves at the expense of the locals. The system of tax farming, where private companies or individuals bid for the right to collect taxes in a region, was notoriously prone to abuse, with tax collectors squeezing every last denarius, and then some from the already burdened populace. If you had a grievance, your access to justice would be far more limited than in Rome. Good luck getting a sympathetic hearing from a governor who barely speaks your language and is more interested in feathering his own nest before his term expires. Customer service from the provincial governor's office was likely to be lacking. Security could also be a much bigger issue. While Rome had its dangers, it also had the urban cohorts and a semblance of order, at least during the day. In many provincial areas, especially those further from major military garrisons or closer to restless frontiers, banditry could be rampant. Roman roads might connect places, but they also provided convenient routes for robbers and highwaymen. Local unrest, tribal feuds, or spillover from frontier conflicts could make life incredibly precarious. You might find that the peaceful countryside you imagined is actually a place where you sleep with one eye open and a heavy stick by your side. And then there's the cultural dynamic. Roman rule brought certain benefits, no doubt roads, aqueducts, a common legal framework, access to wider trade networks. But it also meant the imposition of Roman authority, Roman taxes, and often Roman culture on peoples who had their own long-established traditions. This could lead to resentment, resistance, and a simmering undercurrent of tension. While many local elites eagerly adopted Roman ways to advance their own status, the average farmer or artisan might have viewed the Romans as an occupying power, a distant and demanding master. The Edict of Caracalla in 212 AD, a landmark decree that granted Roman citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire, was a monumental event. Overnight, millions of provincials became, at least in legal terms, Romans. This had profound implications for law, taxation, and identity. But citizen or not, your daily struggles in a small provincial town were still dictated by the harvest, by local power structures, and by your ability to pay your taxes to an empire whose grand designs often felt very remote from your everyday life. It's an interesting factoid that even with widespread citizenship, many remote parts of the empire might have had very little direct Roman presence. Local chieftains or councils might still manage daily affairs much as they always had, their main interaction with Rome being the annual visit of the tax collector. Historians still debate the net economic impact of Roman rule on the provinces. Did the benefits of Roman infrastructure, trade networks, and peace outweigh the burdens of taxation and resource extraction for the majority of the provincial population? It's a complex question with no easy answer, as experiences varied wildly. Some regions flourished under Roman rule, becoming vital centers of production and trade. Others languished, their resources drained to support the insatiable appetite of Rome and its legions. For you, the time traveler, venturing into the provinces would be a stark reminder that Rome, the city, for all its flaws, was a unique, privileged bubble. It was the center of power, wealth, and relative opportunity. Out here, in the vast hinterland of the empire, life could be even harsher, more isolated, and more subject to the whims of both local tyrants and distant imperial masters. The grand rhetoric of empire, the talk of Roman peace and civilization, might ring hollow when you're facing a corrupt official, a failed harvest, or the threat of a raid from across the nearest river. Escaping Rome might not mean escaping hardship. It might just mean exchanging one set of problems for another equally challenging set. The main export of some provinces, you might wryly conclude, felt like it was disgruntled locals and interesting new ways to ferment things you probably shouldn't drink. So, you've had a taste of the provinces, and surprise, surprise, it turns out the grass isn't necessarily greener, just differently perilous and possibly more prone to goat-related incidents. Whether you're back in the suffocating embrace of Rome or still trying your luck in some far-flung corner of the empire, a certain weariness has undoubtedly settled deep into your bones. It's not just physical exhaustion from the bad food, the hard labor, or the constant threat of a rogue chamber pot emptying onto your head. It's a soul-deep fatigue, the kind that comes from enduring a relentless barrage of discomforts, dangers, and deprivations, day in and day out, without any real prospect of relief. Think about it. From the moment you first woke up in that scratchy, unfamiliar bed, your 21st century sensibilities have been under constant assault. The cacophony of sounds, the overwhelming, often repulsive smells, the sheer lack of basic sanitation that leaves you feeling perpetually grimy. You've navigated streets that are more obstacle course than thoroughfare, dodging filth, crowds, and dangerously driven carts. You've sampled Roman cuisine, which for someone in your likely station often means coarse bread that could double as a building material and water that you try very hard not to think about too much. Remember that odd factoid about the average Roman diet for the poor being incredibly monotonous? Heavily reliant on grain, often lacking in essential nutrients that daily, grinding lack of variety and proper sustenance isn't just boring, it's debilitating, slowly sapping your strength and resilience. Your Roman survival kit, you'd quickly realize, would primarily consist of a sturdy pair of running sandals and a very, very low set of expectations. Your home, if you can call that cramped, fire-prone, and probably flea-infested space in an insula home, offers little comfort and even less security. You've experienced the Roman version of a 9-to-5, which is more like a sunrise to sundown plus overtime of backbreaking, dangerous labor for wages that barely keep starvation at bay. You've been brutally schooled in the rigid Roman social hierarchy, realizing you're somewhere near the bottom, with all the privileges and protections that entails, which is to say, practically none. You've witnessed the Roman approach to law and order, where justice is often a matter of who you know or how much you can pay, and street justice is swift and brutal. You've seen their idea of fun and games, where death is a spectator sport. You've had a terrifying glimpse into their medical practices, where the cure might genuinely be worse and significantly more painful than the disease. You've learned that travel is an arduous, perilous undertaking. You've navigated the suffocating web of religious obligations and superstitions, terrified of offending one of 1,000 unseen deities. You've struggled in an information vacuum, where rumors run rampant and reliable news is a rare commodity. You're constantly uncomfortable in your rough, impractical Roman clothes. You've felt the chilling insecurity when politics turns violent, and the helplessness when nature unleashes its fury. You've been hemmed in by strict gender roles and societal expectations, and you've realized that education, that key to understanding and advancement, is a luxury far beyond your reach. You've even felt the distant, unsettling tremors of wars and rebellions on the empire's vast frontiers. Each of these challenges, taken individually, would be tough for a modern person, stripped of their familiar comforts, support systems, and knowledge base. But it's not just one thing. It's the cumulative effect. It's the relentless, daily grind of it all. It's the constant stress, the gnawing anxiety, the ever-present low-level fear. It's the lack of privacy, the lack of choice, the lack of any real hope that things will get significantly better. Your modern resilience, your optimism, your very sense of self would be eroded, bit by bit, by this unyielding tide of hardship. If there was a Roman Yelp and you were to leave a review for life in the Roman Empire, it would probably be a scathing 1-star. Atmosphere is occasionally impressive with some nice ruins to be, but service is terrible, everything is trying to kill you, and the sanitation is a joke. Would not recommend for a long-term stay, or even a short one, frankly. This isn't to say that Romans themselves were constantly miserable. They were born into this world. It was their normal. They had their joys, their festivals, their family connections, their own ways of coping and finding meaning. But for you, the out-of-place time traveler, the contrast between their normal and your own would be a chasm too wide to easily bridge. Consider the crisis of the 3rd century, that tumultuous period from roughly 235 to 284 AD. The Roman Empire faced a perfect storm of calamities. Near-constant civil wars with emperors rising and falling like dominoes, some lasting only months. Devastating foreign invasions across multiple frontiers, rampant inflation that made the currency almost worthless, and recurring plagues that decimated the population. It was a time when the accumulated pressures on the empire nearly broke it. For the people living through it, the sense of overwhelm of a world collapsing must have been terrifyingly acute. It's a macro-level example of what you'd be experiencing on a personal level. A system and an individual buckling under the weight of too many concurrent crises. Historians still debate whether the fall of the Western Roman Empire was a sudden collapse or a long, slow transformation, and to what extent internal weaknesses versus external pressures were the primary cause. But for your own personal fall within the Roman world, the cause would be clear. It would be a death by 1,000 cuts, a slow attrition of spirit and body. It wouldn't necessarily be a dramatic end in the arena or a sudden illness, though those are certainly on the table. More likely, it would be the sheer, unyielding weight of everything, grinding you down until you simply couldn't cope anymore. Your main takeaway from this whole hypothetical experience might just be that the good old days were, in fact, mostly good for a very small, very lucky, and probably very heavily armed minority. For everyone else, and especially for an unprepared visitor from the future, it was an endurance test with a very low pass rate. And that, dear listener, is why you almost certainly wouldn't last a day, or at least, not very many of them in the Roman Empire.